In this video, we'll take an in-depth walk through X2 Wolverine's Revenge, a game that in retrospect is quite a novelty. To many, it's best known for its punishing difficulty, as well as its emphasis on stealth gameplay over straightforward combat. However, there's a lot more to discuss about it, like its unique voice cast, some creative mechanics for Wolverine's powers, as well as a story anchored more to the comics than the movies. So I think this game will be a fun one to walk through and analyze, which is what we'll do today in this video. As always, let's first begin with some of its development history. X2 Wolverine's Revenge was developed by Genepool Software, their first game as a newly created studio. Originally, much of the team began at Warthog Games, where they delivered Star Trek Invasion for the PlayStation 1. However, certain members felt that they needed to break away, as described in a quote by Genepool co-founder Dave Anthony in an interview with Fanbyte.com. There's a lot of creative people and there were a lot of egos involved, but I think both sides were at fault. The relationship just wasn't working, so we decided to leave a group of us to form Genepool. A new company needs a new office, and Genepool ended up taking root in a very unique location, a Gothic-style Victorian mansion known at the time as Bruntwood Hall. In another quote by Dave Anthony, he tells Fanbyte, "I loved it because from the outside it looked like a castle with a turret. As soon as I saw it, I was like, I have to be here. I can't look at any other office space now." With this awesome office space secured, Genepool was ready to develop their first title. Originally, the plan was for it to be a follow-up to Star Trek Invasion, but Activision then acquired rights to the X-Men license and felt it had the potential to be more successful. So with that, Genepool began work on a Wolverine game. However, it wasn't initially tied to the movie. Despite the release's title's connection to the X2 film, as well as featuring Hugh Jackman's Wolverine on the cover, the game is actually most closely associated with the comics. In fact, it was originally titled X-Men Wolverine's Revenge when revealed at E3 2002 before being changed to X2 closer to the release of the movie, in hopes of synergizing the releases. There may have at one point been an attempt to link the stories closer together based on a cut Wolverine line I found in the game's files. The voiceover mentions Colonel Stryker, who was the one responsible for Logan's experimentation in the movie. However, this line seems to have been replaced, and Stryker's never mentioned or seen in the game. Here's the voice clip along with the replacement.
"Looks like Stryker's beefed up security since I was here last. Guess they've beefed up security since I was here last."
Since the game is based on the comics, Genepool hired Marvel writer Larry Hama to write the story. Larry was a great choice because he'd been writing Wolverine's solo comic for years and contributed some important stories, including elements of Logan's backstory with Weapon X, which as we'll see shortly is a core aspect of the game's narrative. Another outstanding addition to the crew was their voice actor for Wolverine. It's stated that Hugh Jackman had scheduling conflicts and couldn't voice the role, so instead, Genepool hired Mark Hamill to voice Wolverine. That's right, the same Mark Hamill who played Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars movies, and he's also the man behind the iconic voice of the Joker in Batman the Animated Series.
Now, what is everyone in town talking about?
Your fish?
I told you not to speak!
The Joker's voice is especially memorable, as well as very high-pitched, the opposite of what you'd expect from Wolverine, so you're probably wondering whether or not Mark manages to pull off that lower-toned, gruff voice. I'll let you decide by first watching the game's intro FMV cutscene, which both gives you a good taste of Hamill's Wolverine voice, as well as some backstory before the actual game begins.
It comes back to me in the blink of an eye. Bits and pieces. Like the dream you start to forget as soon as you wake up. Or maybe more like a nightmare. I was a hard guy for the Cloak and Dagger boys up in Ottawa. Not really an agent, more like the guy who cleans up.
So what's it gonna be, Logan? The easy way or the hard way?
I messed up, so what? There was no reason to do what they did. No reason at all.
You always were a chump, Logan.
Personally, I think Hamill's Wolverine voice is pretty solid, although I do feel like there are moments where he occasionally slips out of it a bit. That being said, I think overall he does a good job throughout the rest of the game, and you'll hear some better examples as we continue forward. As far as the intro scene itself, it follows the comics quite closely, namely the Weapon X series from 1988. That series also began by showing us Wolverine's capture outside of a bar, intermixed with him being experimented on in a tank. Our final shot is also on this guy, another character from those comics. He's gone by a few names such as Truett Hudson and Andre Thornton, but most commonly is just the Professor, and he's the director of the Weapon X procedure on Wolverine. So yeah, there have been two key Professor X's in Wolverine's life. On the negative side, Professor Andre Thornton of Weapon X, and on the positive side, Professor Charles Xavier of the X-Men, who we'll see later as well. But after this introductory cutscene, we're thrown into Act 1 of the story, titled Rebirth, where our gameplay begins. Before getting into the game, I want to briefly jump back to the Weapon X comic series to provide some extra context. So after Logan's capture and imprisonment as a test subject, the Professor and the rest of the crew at Weapon X began the bonding procedure of the virtually indestructible metal adamantium onto Wolverine's entire skeleton. Thanks to his healing factor, Logan was able to survive the procedure, and the bonding was a success. The next phase of their experiment was to test Wolverine as a controllable weapon. To do so, they attached a variety of cables, receivers, and battery packs onto him, which allowed them to monitor and control him. For example, they were able to manually control his claws from the facility. Then of course is the iconic helmet that they put on him, which allowed them to further monitor his abilities as well as maintain signals from a longer distance. They would then send Wolverine all wired up out into the wilderness to test his abilities, like pitting him against a wild bear. Eventually, Logan was able to break free of their control and went on a rampage through the Weapon X facility, which is where we pick up in the game.
Look at him. He's magnificent. He's more like an enhanced animal, living off instinct.
Not animal.
What?
The open mic. He's listening to the Wrangler's headset.
Not animal. I am a man. You did this to me. You hurt me.
Shut him down.
I'm coming for you.
Terminate Weapon X.
I like that they used the "not an animal, I'm a man" line, since it's used similarly in the comics where the Professor and Wolverine have a similar exchange during his escape. I think it's a good line that sums up a lot of Wolverine's internal struggle, as attempting to balance his animalistic nature and humanity will continue to plague him even after Weapon X, and we'll see that a bit in the gameplay too. Speaking of which, this begins our first playable level, as well as a brief combat tutorial. The first prompt introduces us to a cool mechanic based around Wolverine's claws. In this game, we can manually extend or retract Wolverine's claws whenever we want, and there are pros and cons associated with both. To start, slashing with your claws deals a lot of damage, but it's also a bit slower and negates your healing factor. On the flip side, if you retract your claws, you can punch much faster, and having your claws sheathed while out of combat allows you to regenerate health. This isn't how it works in the comics, but for the game, I thought it was a clever idea to balance out your healing, as well as provide some incentive to not just run around claws out the entire time. I also found that fighting barehanded provided a faster means of triggering the strike mechanic, another intriguing feature in this game. Strike is essentially a finishing move, which can be triggered on a single opponent if you've stunned them with non-claw attacks, or on multiple opponents at once if you're positioned properly between them. As you'd imagine, this is a very powerful attack when faced against multiple enemies, so positioning becomes quite important in these conflicts. In these early levels, you can easily one-shot enemies by triggering strike, but they'll become more resistant to it in later levels, requiring you to level up your strike ability. To do so, you need to collect dog tags, which brings us to stealth. When you begin a Wolverine game, you probably expect more of a hack-and-slash style of gameplay. A unique aspect of this game is that stealth is actually the more prevalent playstyle. One thing I like is how Genepool enhanced stealth by tying Wolverine's senses into it. Wolverine is best known for his claws and healing factor, but he also has heightened senses, making him an incredible tracker. By holding the left trigger, you enter Senses mode, obfuscating the world around you but highlighting details that you wouldn't otherwise notice in your normal vision. For example, seeing the scent trail of a nearby enemy, alerting you that someone is around the corner. Or thermal footprint trails, both leading you to an enemy as well as showing if there's a pattern to the path that they take, allowing you to sneak past them if you want. Using your senses also allows you to see in the dark to traverse pitch black areas, as well as navigate minefields without triggering any of the explosives. So there's quite a lot of utility to Wolverine's senses, and I appreciate how Genepool emphasized the importance of these often overlooked abilities. The most important aspect of Senses mode, though, is that it allows you to move more stealthily, making it harder for enemies to detect you. You can even hug up against walls and peer around corners to get the drop on nearby guards. You'll do this a lot since sneaking up on enemies triggers a stealth strike, instantly killing them and rewarding you a dog tag. If you collect enough dog tags to reach the specified threshold, you'll unlock the next tier of strike abilities all the way up to tier 4, and each tier produces fancier animations and progressively higher damage output. so you're incentivized to play especially stealthy early on so you can quickly unlock these tiers and not fall behind in damage. We'll talk about the strike mechanic more later on in the video, but I think that should give you a good idea of how it works and how critical it is to the gameplay. As we continue through the facility, we're soon approached by a rather cocky opponent named General Kirby, potentially as a reference to Marvel illustrator Jack Kirby. Now that we've had some practice with the combat basics, the General emerges to give us a bit more of an advanced challenge. I will say that I really like the 1v1 combat in this game, since it can feel quite strategic as you try to anticipate and adapt to your opponent's attacks while looking for openings of your own, much like a boxing or MMA match. Along those lines, I also like that Genepool mapped different buttons for punch attacks and kick attacks, so you can pull off some limited combos using those two buttons, but more strategically, it also got me thinking about the range of my attacks. Punches were nice for a quick flurry of damage, but sometimes required me to get closer to an enemy than I'd like. Alternatively, kicks felt safer since I could connect a hit from farther away, as well as stagger and open them up. So I thought that added some nice depth to the combat, and I found it to be a lot of fun. But after defeating the General, we'll take his keycard, which grants us access underground, which is where we reach our first checkpoint. While we're on the topic, this is how each level in the game is broken up, and it's an aspect that's often criticized. The game is split up into 6 acts, and there are varying numbers of parts within each act. The end of each part is essentially your checkpoint, with no additional saves in between. Some parts are relatively short, but as we'll see later, some can get quite long, and dying in the middle of one sends you right back to the beginning of that part. The game is challenging in general, so this all-or-nothing approach within parts can make it feel a lot more punishing, which we'll talk more about throughout the video. Next, we continue underground as we make our way to the main facility. Along the way
You ain't even begun to hurt yet, short stuff.
So that's another thing about this game, it can actually get quite scary at times. Some of it may not be intentional, like with the more jagged-edged character models, but some things are, such as Sabretooth's creepy all-white eyes and menacing expression. But I also really love the audio that plays during this moment, since it subtly elevates the creep factor by providing some spine-chilling, disorienting music. Check it out again for yourselves.
You ain't even begun to hurt yet, short stuff.
I think this is a really phenomenal introduction for Sabretooth. Since he's Wolverine's iconic rival, you want him to feel scary and intimidating to the player. I think on a psychological level, this scene succeeds in providing that because it's so quick and abrupt that we hardly have time to register what's going on. Just when we're getting comfortable with the gameplay, we're interrupted unexpectedly by this terrifying monster man who takes away all control from the player and makes Wolverine look powerless against him. If you're unfamiliar with the comics or movies, this probably raises a lot of questions too, since you wouldn't even know who just attacked you. Even still, this quick interaction also succeeds in establishing that the two of them have some kind of history, even if Wolverine isn't immediately aware of it. Speaking of which, let's look at that history a bit. Details between them are a bit murky though, since both received false memory implants during their time at Weapon X, and the comics have retconned things as well. For this video, I'm mostly going to focus on the comic stories that would have been available at the time of the game, since that's what Larry Hama and Genepool would have likely been pulling from, and I'm hoping that'll also prevent us from getting too deep into the weeds with things. So to start, the moment that really ignited the rivalry between Wolverine and Sabretooth was when Sabretooth killed Logan's girlfriend Silver Fox on Logan's birthday. Sabretooth has a fascination with birthdays, and this would begin a trend of him messing with Logan on that day especially. In the early 1960s, Logan became a member of Team X alongside Sabretooth. This is where they both received memory implants, making it difficult to determine the truth behind their past. For example, some of these fake memories made them believe that Sabretooth was Wolverine's father, and other memories called into question whether or not Sabretooth actually murdered Silver Fox that day at the cabin. To make that even more confusing, Silver Fox herself was alive and part of Team X. However, it's possible that that was an imposter of some sort, as later comic issues suggest that Sabretooth did in fact kill Silver Fox that day at the cabin. Regardless, it was during their time with Team X that Wolverine and Sabretooth were experimented on. As far as Team X itself, it was a Black Ops unit established by the CIA and the Weapons Plus program, the latter of which was a program aimed at creating super soldiers. For reference, Captain America is considered Weapon 1 since he was the first successful super soldier. Eventually, Wolverine quit Team X and went his own way. Years later though, when the Weapons Plus program was on its 10th iteration, aka Weapon X, Wolverine was captured and brought in for experimentation, like in the game. It seems Sabretooth was being experimented on at this time too, and escaped in the chaos created by Wolverine. Another detail I thought was fun regarding the Sabretooth jump scare is that if you go into senses mode before entering the room, you'll actually be able to spot him ahead of time. A pheromone trail extends across the doorway, a hint that someone is around the corner. If you peer around the corner with your camera, you can even see him standing there. There's nothing you can do to stop him from grabbing you, but I thought it was cool that you can anticipate his presence ahead of time. Moving on though, we shake off the damage from Sabretooth and continue through the facility. Throughout these next two parts, our basic gameplay skills will be tested more thoroughly as we encounter more elaborate areas filled with enemies containing both stealth and combat opportunities. I'll go into more detail regarding my thoughts on the combat and stealth later, but for now I do want to compliment the game's pacing, since I think it did a good job of teaching and reinforcing gameplay ideas while providing areas that allowed me to experiment and hone my skills. We're tested even further when we reach the genetic research wing. Here we encounter some failed experiments and they're looking for a fight. This enemy type is a lot more aggressive and makes for a very challenging opponent in these early levels. Not to mention, this first encounter occurs after clearing an area filled with a lot of guards, with no saves in between, which makes this fight feel even more tense. You can also see some gameplay issues that make this fight more challenging than it should be, like the last hit of your combo chain phasing through them, or how sometimes when you try to flip behind them, Wolverine won't clear the jump and you'll just land back in front of them. These technical issues persisted throughout the entire game, not just with this enemy type, which I want to point out so you get an idea of how certain elements of the game aren't entirely refined, leading to a more challenging gameplay experience. So the game's reputation for being difficult isn't just due to its natural difficulty, but other unintended factors as well, which we'll discuss more as we continue. For now though, we fight our way through some more failed experiments before taking an elevator to a lower level where we encounter Sabretooth again.
You can't hide from me.
I really like how we're just getting small teases of Sabretooth as we move through the facility, and I found it intimidating the way he's just toying with Wolverine. Any one of these last two encounters could have been boss fights, but he's just getting a lick in and moving on. These brief encounters had an impact on me since I recall feeling anxious about the inevitable boss fight that must be coming towards the end of the level, so I think the way Genepool teases Sabretooth here is really effective. He actually did us a favor in this last encounter too, since he removed the helmet for us. Now we can see Wolverine's face, and I'm really digging how creepy he looks, similar to Sabretooth with the all-white eyes. He'll have pupils later in the game, but for now, I think this look does a good job of reinforcing the animalistic state Logan's in as he attempts to escape the facility. Continuing on, we head into the next room and find a scientist who's trapped with some failed experiments. Our goal is to find the professor, so we'll need the scientist's help to track him down, meaning we have to protect this guy as he leads us further into the facility. Keep in mind, we still haven't saved for a while, so these fights are all very tense. Thankfully, your healing factor keeps you going from fight to fight. To fully heal up, you need to retract your claws and stay out of combat until you're healed to a point where you're ready to continue. It's a clever use of Wolverine's healing factor and help to make it so you don't feel too unstoppable. My only complaint is that it's a very tedious mechanic. You'll pretty much just stand around or pace in an area while your health slowly regenerates, which didn't feel great in regard to pacing. I would have preferred something where we can hold a button outside of combat to heal rapidly to get us back into the gameplay faster. Still, I liked its function in the game, and being able to regenerate to full health felt thematic to Wolverine. Continuing on, we follow the scientist further through the facility until we reach a room that he says contains the keycard we need. We enter the room first, and of course, a door shuts behind us. We've been double-crossed, but this at least triggers our next save point, and I breathe a heavy sigh of relief. That relief is only temporary though, as we find out that the scientist trapped us in a room with Sabretooth, and that it's time for the boss fight that I've been dreading. It's actually not too tough of a fight though, once you get a sense of what the game wants you to do. At first, I assumed it was going to be more of a straightforward hand-to-hand brawl, which you can do for a while, but eventually Sabretooth's healing factor will prevent him from taking any further damage. You need to hit him with something powerful, and thankfully, there's an explosive tanker in the room. So your goal is to trigger a strike on Sabretooth, which I typically did by just flipping behind him, which allowed me to grab him and throw him at the environment. Positioning is everything though, since you want to line him up so that when you're behind him, he'll be facing the explosive tanker. You'll have to throw him into it 3 times to get it to fully explode, and that's essentially the goal of this fight. It's not quite as easy as it sounds though, since Sabretooth will be actively attacking you while also doing flips himself to adjust his positioning. Not only that, but he can pick you up and throw you too, giving you a taste of your own medicine. He has a pounce move where he can pick you up and slam you as well, so he definitely feels like a powerful foe, and you get a good sense of his strength and size during this fight. So overall, although the fight itself is pretty straightforward, I thought it was a good introductory boss fight for the first act of the game. Once you throw him into the tanker for the final time, the impact will take his health down to 0. He's not unconscious though, and begins walking around again. I thought that was actually pretty cool because it took me by surprise and left me unsure if he had more tricks up his sleeve. Thankfully, he collapses back to the ground, and we're able to land one last finisher on him, where Wolverine grabs him and throws him against a containment tank. Sabretooth is legitimately down for the count now, and we swipe his keycard. You might think at this point you would get a save too, right? Nope, you're going to continue on and you'll fight another enemy as you continue your pursuit of the Professor. It's not too challenging, but it's certainly nerve-wracking for fear of dying to a stupid minion and having to do the boss fight all over again. For the most part though, we get a bit of a breather as we backtrack through the facility until we finally get to confront the Professor.
Go. Not you.
You think you've won, don't you? Well, you haven't. You're a dead man.
Can a dead man kill?
Only a fool designs a weapon without a failsafe. All Weapon X subjects were implanted with a dormant killer virus. The Shiva strain, 100% lethal.
How long?
For a normal human, 1 year. But with a mutant healing factor, who knows?
Before continuing on, there are a few things I want to discuss about that cutscene. First, we get a brief glimpse at 2 other scientists hiding with the Professor. They're actually notable characters from the comics who contributed to Wolverine's experimentation at Weapon X. On the right is Dr. Cornelius, and he was the one who created all the equipment to monitor Wolverine, like the helmet and battery packs. On the left is Dr. Hines, and she was more of a lab assistant. Cornelius and Hines willingly participated in Wolverine's experimentation, but at least showed moments of internal struggle as they faced the morality of what they were doing. At one point in the comic, they put Wolverine through a simulated Weapon X escape in his mind to see how he'd act. The result was that Logan spared Dr. Hines, and wanted to spare Dr. Cornelius up until he accidentally fired a gun at him. But with those good intentions in mind, I thought it was fitting that Logan let them both leave the room at the beginning of this cutscene. In that dream simulation, Logan did kill the Professor, but first cut off his hand. When Logan makes his legitimate escape from the program, we only see him slice his way into the room containing Hines, Cornelius, and the Professor, before it cuts to him fleeing into the wilderness. However, when Logan encounters the Professor again years later, we see that his hand was cut off like in the simulation, suggesting that Logan still cut it off. So in the game, it seems the Professor is let off a lot easier, since we'll later see that Logan allowed him to live, and keep both of his hands. The Professor also mentioned the Shiva virus, which is implanted into all Weapon X experiments and will eventually kill them. In the comics, Larry Hama also used something called Shiva against Team X, but it wasn't a virus. Instead, it was a killer robot. I think it could have been really cool to be pursued by a killer robot throughout the story, but I still like the choice to use it as a virus here, since it provides a good ticking clock for the rest of the game and puts Logan on a mission, as we'll see in the next clip, which takes place in the present day.
That was a long time ago, Hank. I spent years wandering the woods of northern Alberta, living wild. Then I came here, to Salem Center. I stopped thinking about what those goons told me on my last day at the Weapon X facility.
Start thinking about it now, Logan. The Shiva strain virus that has been dormant in your central nervous system has mutated to bypass your healing factor. It's active and incubating.
Ooh. How long before it hatches, Hank?
Our best estimates suggest about 2 days before it goes toxic.
2 days? That's my birthday. Ain't that a kick in the head?
Our estimates could be wrong.
Maybe you ought to give me my presents now. You know I ain't taking this lying down.
I didn't expect you to. That's why I've been keeping Professor Xavier in the loop about your condition.
Logan, you're going back to the Weapon X facility. That's where all the answers are and the most likely place to find an antiviral serum.
If it exists.
They weren't insane. They wouldn't let a mutated virus loose in the world without a way to stop it.
Stick this to the inside of your wrist with organic epoxy. It tells you how much time...
I get the picture. It's gonna be a big help. Your estimates are wrong.
Scott and Jean will fly you as far as Edmonton in the Blackbird. A bush pilot will take you the rest of the way. Good luck, Logan. My thoughts are with you. In more ways.
It's pretty awesome seeing a couple X-Men make an appearance. First is of course Beast, aka Henry McCoy, the X-Men's resident genius and medical expert. I thought it was funny that he has a cheesy poster on the wall in the background, which is supposed to reference the real world one that says, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." Beast's version of it replaces the word crazy with mutant. Then there's Professor Xavier, who sadly might have the worst face model in the game. He's got a great voice actor though, Patrick Stewart, the actor who plays him in the movies. He's great as Xavier, so it's great to hear him in this game. Professor X also mentions that Scott and Jean will fly Logan for part of the journey. This of course refers to Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, and Jean Grey, aka Phoenix. Sadly, we won't see Cyclops or Jean in the game, but it's cool to hear them referenced. As Xavier mentioned, Wolverine's connecting flight is through a random pilot who will get him back to the Weapon X facility. It can never be that easy though, as a helicopter intercepts them and damages the plane with a missile. Strangely, the pilot doesn't seem too concerned.
I've called in the airstrike.
It's tough to read, but at this moment we can also see the name of the airline on the side of the plane, which I believe reads Alpha Freight. This is a reference to Alpha Flight, the Canadian superhero team that Wolverine was originally part of, and nearly led, until Professor X offered him a role on the X-Men. The plane crash lands shortly after this, and Wolverine is left stranded in the wilderness while enemies patrol the area. As we start the mission, we can see in the top right-hand corner a countdown timer until the Shiva virus goes lethal. We also get voiceover from Professor Xavier, who will telepathically guide us through the rest of the game.
You must have been badly wounded in the plane crash, Wolverine. Try to avoid trouble for now.
I thought this was a really creative use of Xavier since it provides the player with a helpful guide while also staying thematic to the characters and universe. Interestingly, I think Xavier's voiceover was meant to be used to a larger degree since I found some unused clips where he describes needing you to log your position, and he also comments on your skill level between levels, based on your performance.
Logan, Hank will chart your progress and report your developments based on current bioclock settings, area covered, current position, health, and several classes of risk factor calculations. Remember though, Logan, there is a deadly virus in your system and the road ahead is uncertain. Hank can only calculate data he receives from us both. Several bad performances, and your life could be in jeopardy. Would you like me to store your position within Cerebra? Are you ready to log your position? Logan, the progress you've made is remarkable. Well done, Logan. Hank reports that you're making good time. Good progression, Logan. Keep your senses acute. Hank's data reveals your actions as very effective. Well done, Wolverine. Great work, Wolverine. You're progressing well. Try to take care of your health, though. Logan, your progression is adequate according to our data. Hank informs me that your accomplishments are typical to a person of your abilities. Progression is normal. Keep it up. Progression is average, but you only just made it here in one piece. Well done. Haven't heard from you in a while. Your progress is just about on target, Logan. Logan, you cannot continue with performances like this. You are dangerously close to not completing your objective, Logan. It seems you haven't done too well so far. You must increase your skill levels. You're lucky to be still alive, Logan. Keep alert out there and try not to get sidetracked. Your health is low, Logan. You barely scraped through this area alive.
I don't recall any of those being used in the game, and my assumption is that there was a deeper system tied to your score at the end of each level, but I couldn't confirm that. I also found it interesting that he mentioned Cerebra a couple times in the unused clips, but never in the actual game. You're likely familiar with Cerebro, the device Charles uses to amplify his powers and search for mutants. Cerebra, on the other hand, was used in the 2001 comic series New X-Men, where Beast describes it as Cerebro's older sister, boosting Charles' mutant locating abilities to a global range, so I thought it was cool to hear Cerebra referenced. There were a lot of other unused Professor X audio clips, and I'll play more of them throughout the video too. But for now, like the professor said, it seems our healing factor was overtaxed in the crash, so we have minimal health and won't be able to regenerate it back for a while. I thought this was a cool way to start Act 2, and I also like it as a subtle tutorial, since it forces us to practice and become more comfortable with the stealth mechanics. If you try to play more aggressively, you'll be instantly gunned down by the chopper. I actually like this section quite a bit, since it was pretty open and contained some unique interactions. The first is a stealth kill you can perform from above an enemy. If you sneak your way up to this ledge, you can leap down onto this enemy and kill him. Annoyingly, the camera really struggles to showcase these kills, which is the first example of the camera issues in the game. There's also an optional stealth kill across a destroyed bridge. This soldier is very dedicated to his job and is attempting to retrieve the cargo from his truck before it falls off the bridge. As you get closer to him, he'll slip off the bridge and be left holding for dear life. You now have 5 seconds to save him. If you're successful, you'll rescue him from the bridge, and then kill him yourself, earning a dog tag. To progress the level though, Wolverine must use himself as a conduit to power up the doors to the facility, at which point we'll sneak our way in. Once inside, we'll activate a lift to take us deeper inside. Unfortunately, a bunch of guards are alerted to the area and are patrolling the lift. Stealth is no longer an option, and it looks like we're in for a fight against numerous enemies. So without much else of a choice, we jump down and start fighting them all. Earlier, I complimented the one-on-one fights in this game, so let's talk about the fights against multiple enemies. Right off the bat, the mechanics for fighting multiple enemies aren't as fun as against a solo enemy, but it's not bad and there's still some decent strategy involved. For example, hitting an enemy locks you onto them, slowing you down and making it harder to work the room. So you have to be strategic regarding when you want to square off against one enemy, and that's usually when you think you can also position yourself between them and at least one other enemy to do a strike move. Strike moves are your key to fighting off crowds, since you can one-shot or at least significantly damage 2 to 3 enemies at once by triggering it. Outside of that, the only way you're able to mix up your targets on the fly is through evasive attacks like dives or slides, which can allow you to quickly damage enemies while also making you a harder target to hit. This also makes them drop their guns, which gives you a significant edge. Additionally, there's also Wolverine's Berserker Rage. At the top left, we can see 2 bars. The bottom one is our health, and the top one is our rage. As we hit enemies or take damage, that bar will increase. At any point, while the bar is significantly filled, we can double tap the right trigger to enter a rage mode until it depletes. In this rage, Wolverine's speed is increased, he takes less damage, and he deals out much higher damage. This is great when trying to clear out a room full of enemies, because you can carve through them really quickly. You have to monitor the rage bar though, because if you're getting beat up a lot and it fills all the way, Wolverine will go into a rage automatically, which could still finish a fight for you, but it'll probably feel like a waste. I thought this felt like a thematic use of Wolverine's Berserker Rage though. The same way Wolverine struggles to keep it in check, the player must do the same or else end up in a blind fury at an inopportune time. On the topic of Berserker Rage, there were also some unused voice lines regarding it from both Wolverine and Professor X, which I found interesting.
I feel the Berserker Rage coming on. Going feral. Gotta remember, I'm human. Gotta...
You must try to control your wild side, Logan. You cannot think logically once a Berserker Rage has taken hold. Your feral self is a dangerous persona. You may jeopardize your mission if you lose control. Logan, can you still hear me? Listen to me, Wolverine. Don't let yourself go. Not now, Wolverine. Hold it back.
We'll talk more about the overall combat when we get to the gameplay section of the video, but so far I think it's pretty solid for what it is. It can feel quite clunky and inaccurate at times, but I at least like the amount of combat options at your disposal. But after clearing the room, we're free to head down the lift. When we arrive, we find a bunch of dead soldiers. We didn't do it, so the question is, who did? It only takes a moment to find the answer if you head into the security room and watch the camera feed. That probably just looks like a blob of white textures to you, but what we're looking at is a Wendigo. The Wendigo is a creature from the comics, and it even ties back to Wolverine's first ever comic appearance, that of which occurred within an issue of the Incredible Hulk series. The basis of that story revolves around the Hulk being drawn to an area in Canada containing the Wendigo. The two end up getting into a massive brawl, and the Canadian military calls in Wolverine, one of their agents at the time, to stop the fight and apprehend Hulk. Hulk and Wolverine first work together to neutralize the Wendigo, and then return to fighting each other. At one point, Wolverine gets distracted, and Hulk takes the opportunity to sucker punch him, knocking him out. The Wendigo also managed to escape, but it's sort of a tragic tale of its own, because the Wendigo isn't just a creature, but a curse imbued on a living person. The curse applies to any human who eats the flesh of another in the Canadian wilderness. Upon doing so, they're turned into the white-furred beast known as the Wendigo. The Wendigo that the Hulk and Wolverine fought was actually a man named Paul Cartier. Paul had been on a hunting expedition with 2 friends when they were attacked by wolves. One of the hunters was mortally wounded, and the 3 men retreated into a cave for shelter. Here, they faced starvation, and Paul succumbed to eating the injured member to survive. It was here that he gained the curse of the Wendigo. However, the curse was then transferred from Paul to his friend George, which George voluntarily chose as a favor to Paul's sister, who he loved. Although I think she only saw George as a friend. Anyway, in the game, it's never confirmed who the human is underneath the Wendigo, but the bio fort states the spirit of the Wendigo still remembers its encounter with Wolverine. Logan has more pressing concerns for now though, the first of which is progressing deeper into the base without alerting any of the guards. Stealth is required since getting caught will trigger an alarm, locking down the base. Our goal is to take out all the guards in the area without being caught, and it's actually pretty fun puzzling your way through here, although it'll probably take a few tries to parse out the exact order you're supposed to do it. That will actually be a common theme throughout the game, but here it's not too bad, and I think this is another good early section to help train your stealth skills. Once you make it past all the enemies, you'll leave the exit, which brings you to the mines, which is where we finally encounter the dreaded Wendigo. Even though Wolverine was able to hold his own against the Wendigo in the comics, you don't want to try to fight him here since he'll just grab you and bite your head off. So instead, what we'll do is use the soldiers in the area to our advantage. I didn't mention it earlier, but you can grab an enemy if you first stun them. Our goal now is to find an enemy and grab them so that we can throw them to Wendigo to temporarily satisfy its hunger. As awful as it sounds, it's actually quite satisfying sacrificing these enemies to the Wendigo. After doing so, it'll run off deeper into the caves before blocking our path again. So we'll continue this pattern of capturing soldiers and feeding them to the Wendigo throughout this section. Eventually, we'll end up in the Wendigo's lair. It's not very happy to see us, and we no longer have any choice but to deal with it directly, which leads us into our next boss fight. Initially, it's not entirely clear what you're supposed to do here. It's just us and the Wendigo on this small circular platform, which is littered with crystals. It'll occasionally chase after us, but running it through the crystals doesn't seem to have any effect, and straight up attacking it doesn't seem to do much either. Even if it falls off the platform, it doesn't take any damage. Wolverine isn't as nimble though, so if we fall, we'll be impaled on the spikes below, leading to a game over. Once I figured out what to do though, the boss fight was actually pretty straightforward. The crystals are meant to just be obstacles in your path to make it harder for you to escape the Wendigo. The key is to outlast its chase until it stops to take a breather, at which point you can perform a strike where you grab its tail and throw it as far as you can. This will damage it, and if you manage to throw it off the platform, you'll do bonus damage, even though it doesn't look like it takes any damage in that mini cutscene. Regardless, it's a fairly simple fight in concept, but still challenging because a momentary slip-up can lead to the Wendigo backhanding you off the platform into an instant game over. So you have to play quite carefully, but overall, I thought this was a fun boss fight and is probably the one I enjoyed the most now that I think about it. And after dealing enough damage, you're able to perform one final strike action on the Wendigo, where you'll provide the final knockout stabs. It's not dead yet though, since Wendigos are highly durable and immortal beings. Wolverine learns this the hard way when he believes it to be down and out, only for it to quickly return to consciousness and launch Wolverine through the wall. This actually worked out quite nicely since it allows Wolverine to hitch a ride atop a caravan heading to the place he wanted to go anyway.
Hey! How you doing?
Chuck, can you hear me? I'm at the base.
Excellent news.
Yeah? Well, hold fire on the celebrations. Security looks tighter than one of Jean's costumes.
Quite.
Okay.
Proceed with caution, Wolverine. I have reason to suspect that there are others interested in obtaining the information you seek. Others who bear you ill will.
They're gonna have to get online, Chuck. But thanks for the tip.
This begins Act 3, and Wolverine has a little over 24 hours to find the cure to the Shiva virus. We'll need to head deeper into the base in hopes of finding the answers we seek. Act 3 is also, in my opinion, a pivotal point in the game because it feels like it takes the training wheels off and fully opens up the difficulty more than before, in both good ways and bad. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this is the level where most people quit the game, because for me, this is where I started to feel the negatives begin to outweigh the positives, but we'll discuss it more as we go along. Things start off pretty fun though. We get to sneak up on a guard and throw him into a giant security monitor, and we're given a relatively open area to explore. A lot of areas are locked down, so we'll spend time creeping around the base, finding ways to open up previously locked areas. There are definitely some fun moments here too, like using your senses to identify a wobbly box that contains a decoder, and finding a barracks full of sleeping soldiers that you can take out one by one with a painful crotch shot and repetitive one-liner.
Wakey, wakey. Wakey, wakey. Wakey, wakey. Wakey, wakey.
But there are some annoyances too, the first of which is how things are often unclear or don't seem intuitive. For example, there's an area that has a sizable guard patrol in the area, and without walking through cameras or being seen, alarms would go off, causing guards to rush me. After testing it, I realized it wasn't because I was caught or tripped an alarm, it was just because I wasn't holding down the stealth button at that time, which I wouldn't think to do because there weren't enemies in close proximity. So just taking a small step or two out of stealth mode can instantly throw alarms. Another example is a minefield you have to cross, which conceptually is easy to do with your senses. However, the camera is absolutely terrible in this game. It adjusts itself at unpredictable times and often at the worst moment possible, so just walking forward is a challenge, almost like Wolverine is wearing drunk goggles. So you're trying to make precise movements while the camera begins to steer you in a different direction, which can easily result in you walking into a mine. Here's a good example of what I mean regarding the camera. Keep in mind that during this whole clip, I'm not moving the camera myself, I'm just walking around. The camera continually tries to readjust itself, I think based on where Wolverine is facing as well as objects in the area, maybe, but as you can see, it's making a lot of adjustments in this small area, and it's rarely predictable. So imagine trying to move the camera yourself, then having the camera readjust itself, forcing you to adapt to wherever it just turned, and trying to reposition the camera again to where you actually want it. It's a constant tug of war, and even minor camera adjustments made accurate movements difficult. And to be clear, this was something prevalent throughout the entire game, not just this level. And in a game that's already meant to be challenging, the camera made things unnecessarily frustrating. The worst section of this level by far, though, is when you take control of a turret gun. You'd think that this is where you'd feel the most powerful, but it's actually where you're the weakest. Enemies begin rushing you as soon as you man the gun, and their bullets do a lot of damage very quickly. Even worse is that you're not given any button prompts to tell you how to exit the gun, so you'll likely die while trying to figure it out. The way you do it is annoying too, because you have to hold down the exit button for a few seconds before Wolverine actually hops off. Those seconds are precious and could easily result in you dying. So if you start losing health rapidly, even if you have a decent amount of health left at the moment, you need to immediately hold that button and hop off, because waiting isn't worth the risk. Then begins the tedium of stepping off to the side while you wait for your health to slowly regenerate, before hopping back on for a very panicked few seconds of shooting. Trying to determine what you need to shoot isn't clear either. At first glance, the explosive tanker and the electrical panel seem like your targets, but you'll get mixed signals from them. For example, here I started blasting the electrical panel, and it looks like I'm doing some damage based on all the sparks. However, nothing significant is actually happening. It doesn't explode and seems like it'll just spark forever. So I turn my attention to the tanker and blow it up. So we're good, right? No. So I return back to the gun and start aiming at the white tanks above the control panel and blow those up. It's still not deactivated. All the while, I have to take the intermittent breaks to heal up, since I can only survive on the gun for a few seconds while trying to figure out what I'm supposed to shoot at. But after healing, I attempt shooting at the panel again, and now it blows up, deactivating the gate. It seems like the game wants you to hit certain things in a certain order, but hitting objects out of order with no result makes the player think that they're targeting the wrong thing. Pairing that with floaty controls and how quickly you can die while trying to figure this out, it can get infuriating real fast. Even worse, if you do die during the turret section, you'll have a lot of backtracking to do because it occurs a good length ahead of the previous save. So you'll have to do all the stealth, door unlocking, combat, and minefields again before getting another crack at the turret. You don't even get to save after deactivating the gate, since you still have another section to go through after it. So imagine my frustration when I finally made it through the turret section, only to be gunned down by a different turret in the next area. There are actually quite a few intense combat areas still to go through during this part, and it got to a point where I honestly just started to run through it. It's a long level with a lot of opportunity to die, and it definitely needed some kind of checkpoint within it. So that's why I wouldn't be surprised if this was a level where a lot of players hung up the controller. Ironically, once you know what you're supposed to do in this level, you can actually get through it fairly quickly. It's just all the trial and error you have to go through to get there. Continuing on though, and with no save point in sight, we make it into the base's facility and begin exploring within it. We'll encounter a familiar face here, and it's General Kirby, who we fought during the first level, who appears eager for a rematch. He's not too tough though, and like last time, we'll swipe his keycard to continue further. By this point, security has surrounded the building, so we have no choice but to run like hell for the exit. We'll make our way through another series of tunnels, but we'll also eventually find ourselves cornered.
Take him down!
Am I supposed to thank you, or are you just a lousy shot?
Let's just say, it's not your time to die. Yet.
You answer to someone else, don't you?
We all answer to a higher authority. Is that not so?
You're not quite human, are you?
You should talk.
I've never been so relieved to see a save point in my life. But anyway, I want to talk about that cutscene for a moment because I found it intriguing on a couple levels. We're rescued by this mysterious stranger who's listed as someone named Bravo Leader, and I believe he's an original creation for this game. We've actually seen him once before already. If you look closely, he was in the helicopter that shot us down earlier, so it seems like he's in league with someone who has bigger plans for us. This interaction appears to be teasing something for the future as well, however, we're never going to see this guy again. From what I can tell, I think we were supposed to face him as a boss at some point, but it was cut. In the game's files, there are some unused voice lines of his, and they all sound like things he'd say during a fight. There are also some Wolverine and Professor X lines that I assume are tied to him too.
You're faster than you look, mutant. I wasn't ready for that. You sure slipped one by me. You put some hurt on me that time. I'm in a world of hurt, mutant. Like the energy conducting suit, boy? Ah, that feels better. This is gonna hurt you more than me. That's gonna leave a mark. You ain't half the man I expected. The knife bites, don't it, freak? Do you feel it? Do you? You could take someone's eye out with those things.
His shield can rebound projectile weaponry.
You got a permit for those babies? Didn't I see that knife in a Arnie movie? Go on, admit it. You'll be back. Put the play knife away, mister.
Knowing that he was cut makes this scene feel kind of hollow, since we won't get any payoff for his character, but at least his agenda still holds true later in the game. Regardless, it's interesting to think about how a fight against him might have played out. Continuing on, we're now back in the Weapon X facility that we escaped from at the beginning of the game. It's fun retracing our steps and seeing how the environment still has remnants of that escape. For example, we can find the wall that Sabretooth slammed us into. As we make our way further into the facility, we'll find ourselves in the laboratory, which has a bunch of scientists walking around. They won't try to fight and will instead just run away. 2 of them will also drop a key card, allowing us to continue further. We'll soon encounter another scientist, but this one tells us that he'll help us, if we escort him past all the guards. Last time we trusted a scientist and escorted them, they betrayed us, so Wolverine isn't as keen to fall for the same mistake twice. So we escort the scientist for a while, but when given the opportunity to betray him first, Wolverine takes it.
Knucklehead.
Eventually, we find the computer that Logan believes contains the files he's looking for. Unfortunately, all that information has been transferred to the Void Prison, meaning we'll have to head there next in order to retrieve it. However, looking through more of the audio files, it seems Logan was at one point meant to learn some scraps of his past here too. Take a listen.
Wolverine. File opened? Perfect. What? Hold on, this can't be. Name, Logan. Born, James Howlett. Alberta, 1887. Mutant genes descended from mother. One Elizabeth. The rest of the file deleted. No, reclassified and transferred. Ah!
These cut lines refer back to Logan's actual origins in the comics. Like we heard, Logan's real name is James Howlett. His parents were John Howlett Sr. and his mother Elizabeth. On the surface, things were pretty good for the Howletts. They were a wealthy family with their own estate, and John Sr. was a good father and respectable man. James was a normal boy back then too, since his mutant genes hadn't yet emerged. That includes his healing factor, since ironically, James was quite a sickly child back then. It's also mentioned that James had an older brother, John Jr., who took ill and died. However, it's suggested that John Jr. was a mutant like James, since we see claw marks on Elizabeth at one point. Speaking of Elizabeth, she wasn't able to handle the death of her son and was sent to a madhouse. When she returned, she was different and more reclusive. It's also heavily implied that she had an affair with the groundskeeper, Thomas Logan, and that he's James' actual father, which I think is pretty clear based on the resemblance. Sadly, Thomas was not a good man. He was a drunk and very envious of the Howletts. Years later, he decided enough was enough, and planned to break into the estate and convince Elizabeth to run away with him. During their conversation, John Sr. walked in, which began an argument between them. Thomas got so mad that he shot John and killed him. James witnessed the death of John, which triggered not only a rage in him, but also the emergence of his mutant powers, namely his bone claws. James then stabbed Thomas, killing him. Elizabeth was horrified at James' mutation, calling him a monster before casting him out. James fled, but was joined by his relative, Rose, who attempted to take care of him. The 2 of them then left town, and when others asked for his name, Rose told them the fake name, Logan. There's plenty more to discuss regarding Wolverine's past, but that's the gist of his tragic childhood. Going back to the game, once Logan learns that the data he's looking for has been transferred to the Void Prison, the room begins to fill with gas and he has to flee the facility. As we make our exit, a familiar problem emerges.
Hey, birthday boy, I brought you a present. What the? Sorry I didn't get time to gift wrap it.
Ain't you a little early this year?
Figured I surprise you before the Shiva virus does its work.
Bad move. I don't like surprises.
Before getting into the fight itself, I want to mention Sabretooth's outfit, because I believe it's based off of this one, which would have been his current suit in the comics at the time, matching Logan's default suit, which was also current. Interestingly though, it looks like the developers were originally going to use Sabretooth's classic look from the comics based on the E3 2002 trailer, which shows Sabretooth in that style. There's also a concept art that shows this classic design as well. It looks really good, and I wish it at least remained as an alternate suit for him. Going back to the boss fight though, it's time for round 2 against Sabretooth, and this battle will be a bit more involved compared to the first one. Sabretooth is also more aggressive this time around, and less evasive. Like last time, Sabretooth also has grab attacks of his own, and his AI prioritizes throwing us into the nearby fire, which does a lot of damage, so you can't let your guard down too much. Our goal here is to outlast his flurry of attacks so that he'll leave himself open to be thrown at the environment. After throwing him a few times, we'll begin phase 2, where he walks into the fire and begins tossing explosive barrels at us. So this part of the fight really confused me, because you can't go punch him or else you'll be damaged by the fire, as well as the explosion from him dropping the barrel. Sometimes I was able to pull off a dive attack to damage him, but that didn't feel like the proper solution, and it left me too weak to handle the last phase. The only hint you're given is an on-screen message stating that the barrels look like they can bust some heads, but that's pretty vague, so this was another section that I eventually had to look up. What you're supposed to do here is punch the barrels back at Sabretooth after he throws them. Upon reading this, I was at least happy to learn this is a pretty easy phase of the fight once you know what to do, but I was still annoyed at the solution because at no point throughout the rest of the game was punching projectiles something you could do, or even told that you can do. It doesn't seem like a practical solution, and since the game hasn't even suggested it's an option before, it feels unintuitive. Furthermore, we won't use this mechanic for the rest of the game either. I felt that the final phase was equally unintuitive. Sabretooth will begin leaping around, sending fiery shockwaves around the area for you to dodge. Your hint is just to watch for your chance to strike, which isn't very helpful. We've been taught to perform strikes on him from behind, which doesn't seem like an option, and if you try to punch him, he'll just grab you and throw you. What you're supposed to do is stand underneath where he's going to land to perform the strike, which again is something we've never been able to do previously in the game, and with him striking the ground with each jump, standing under him seems like the last place you'd want to be. When you line yourself up properly though, you'll intercept him in the air and perform a series of stabs to knock him out for good.
You were part of the Weapon X program yourself. You know we all have a virus that's gonna kill us.
I knew it a long time ago, Runt. Came all this way just to watch you die.
Yeah, there might be a serum hidden around here.
I found it.
They handed it over to you?
You know me. I can be very persuasive. It's too bad it's only part B. Dead useless without part A. And I do mean dead.
Chuck, can you see this through my eyes?
I have it, Logan. Hank will begin synthesizing it immediately.
Oh, I'd love nothing better than to spend the next few days being new to a pulp Sabretooth. But right now, I gotta go fishing in Lake Michigan.
I found it a bit strange that Sabretooth just offered up part of the serum to Wolverine, but we'll find out later that there may be more behind Sabretooth's actions than we realize now. With part 1 of the serum though, that brings us to Act 4, as Wolverine infiltrates the Void prison. I believe the Void is an original location for the game, but to me it's similar to the Raft prison in the comics, which houses superhuman criminals. The Void, on the other hand, is specifically for mutants, and as Wolverine attempts his infiltration, he encounters a familiar face.
Colossus, old bud. What are you doing here? Sure ain't waiting for a bus.
No, tovarich. I have been hired to, how do they say, enhance security.
The new gatekeeper, huh? Well, I got a problem. The clock is ticking. Gotta get inside, pal. No ifs and buts.
Professor Xavier has informed me of your situation. I am truly sorry, old friend, but I cannot let you pass to the elevator behind me.
Oh?
That is, if I should happen to see you. Good luck, old friend.
It's always nice to see Colossus, and I'm enjoying the cameos within this game. Colossus's appearance was significant here too at the time, because in the comics he was actually dead after sacrificing himself to stop the Legacy virus, so fans would have been especially happy to see him here. Colossus being in charge of security is somewhat similar to the comics as well. During the Fatal Attractions comic series, Colossus was in a dark place after his sister Ileana had died. Due to that event, he no longer trusted Xavier's dream, and when Magneto arrived, offering the X-Men a chance to join his side and live on a mutant sanctuary that he created in space called Avalon, Colossus agreed to join him. While on Avalon, Colossus was in charge of security. He noticed that the X-Men managed to teleport their way onto the base, and he chose to keep their infiltration a secret and allow them to pass. However, he later regretted that decision when it led to a massive brawl, the same one where Magneto ripped Logan's adamantium skeleton from his body. So I found it interesting that Colossus acted similarly here, and we'll see how things go for him and Wolverine in the game shortly. Now inside, Wolverine's first order of business is to blend in easier, so he sneaks up behind one of the guards and steals their outfit. Gameplay-wise, this allows us to freely run around without being spotted if we maintain a far enough distance from guards. Alternatively, if you get too close, everyone will be alerted and you'll have a much harder time progressing. I like this twist on the gameplay, and posing as the guards was a really satisfying addition to stealth, especially when you find a control terminal that electrifies the floors the guards are standing on. This by itself was a lot of fun, since you can lure additional guards to this platform to easily take them out instead of fighting them. We also get another unique stealth strike, where we grab this cook and smash his face into the open burner. I really like the inclusion of these special kills, and they're giving me flashbacks to what Volition would later do in 2005 with their Punisher game, although that game is far more brutal with its special kills. Even though this Wolverine game isn't something I would call brutal or gory, I appreciate that Genepool didn't shy away from the violence. There's still blood when you attack someone with your claws, and Wolverine is legit killing people as he infiltrates areas. The violence is very toned down compared to something like X-Men Origins Wolverine, but I still appreciate that Genepool went as mature as they could while still maintaining a T rating. I also like the next section where Wolverine needs to enter an area with a heat detector. The solution is to enter the meat freezer and wait for your body temperature to lower enough, and then run through the heat detector before your body temperature returns to normal. It's pretty simple, but I thought it was a fun little puzzle. I also have to wonder if this served as inspiration for a moment in the Wolverine Origins game, since it takes the idea a step further by requiring you to freeze Wolverine so he can enter the next area. Either way, even though I had my issues with Act 3, I'm enjoying the creativity in these early missions of Act 4. The creativity continues in the next area, where we find a control panel for a Void drone. When we access it, we're given first-person control of a security drone, which we use to tear through the guards in the next hallway. The drone is armed with 2 weapon options, a machine gun on the left hand, and a plasma shot that you can charge on the right. I thought the code at the bottom left was fun too, because it will update as you perform actions. For example, it'll add a line whenever you charge a plasma shot, as well as when you fire it, including the coordinates of where it lands. Even more fun is when you lock onto a human soldier, it'll list their name. For example, this guy, whose name is apparently Scott McKenna, or this soldier listed as Chad Fazaro. Each enemy has a different name, and I enjoyed these small details. The drone itself is pretty fun too. As with a lot of things in this game, the controls are a bit rough and take some getting used to, but outside of that, it's a lot of fun mowing your way through here. The plasma shot is especially nice because it deals the most damage, and it locks onto enemies, removing some of the stress of the floaty controls. But ultimately, I found this section to be a real highlight. It's short-lived though, since the drone has limited signal strength and shuts down at the end of the hall. Still, it was fun while it lasted, and it's especially satisfying running down this hallway now that it's completely clear of threats. From here, we continue through the prison, but by now, the area is on high alert as the guards look for an intruder, and in a moment, they'll find one.
Take it easy, guys. You don't know what we're dealing with here. Look out!
Where are you, Wolverine? Looking for your little scientist friends, are you? Well, you'd better get on the stick, old son, because if I find them before you do, they're dead meat.
Sabretooth really feels relentless in this game. We just can't shake him no matter how often we beat him, which I think is fitting based on how much of a persistent pain in the ass he is for Wolverine in the comics. And with Sabretooth on the scene, Wolverine needs to get to the scientists even faster. That's easier said than done, since we'll have to make our way through a series of guarded rooms, all of which are quite challenging, not only due to the guards, but also because we'll encounter turret guns, and even void drones like the one we piloted. While we're dealing with these challenges, Sabretooth has other plans, and his next act has a devastating impact on the course of the rest of the game, and even beyond, and you'll see why shortly.
Too quiet around here. We gotta let out the party people. Let my people go.
Condition
Condition Red. Alpha class cells have been breached. The most powerful mutants are loose.
Sabretooth just made things exponentially worse by releasing some incredibly powerful villains from the prison. First of which is Arkady Rossovich, aka Omega Red, who is essentially Russia's version of Weapon X. Instead of adamantium claws though, Omega Red possesses a retractable carbonadium tentacle in each arm, which he can use to drain the life energy from someone. He can even emit death spores from his body, which can weaken or potentially kill those in proximity to him. As powerful as Omega Red is, his main weakness is that the carbonadium in his system poisons him, so he relies on draining people to survive. There is, however, a cure for this known as the carbonadium synthesizer. Back when Wolverine and Sabretooth were part of Team X, they were able to retrieve the synthesizer, but encountered Omega Red as they attempted to flee the area. They barely managed to escape by jumping out of a tall building. In the commotion, Wolverine hid the synthesizer from everyone to assure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. Since Wolverine was the last person to see it, Omega Red hunts him in hopes of prying the location from him. We'll talk about Omega Red more later in the video though, because there's actually a lot more I want to discuss about him. The next escapee is Cain Marko, aka Juggernaut, and there are a couple things I'm not sure many people are aware of about him, so let's talk about his history a bit. The first is that he's related to Charles Xavier, more specifically, their stepbrothers. It all began when an atomic research facility exploded, the same one where Cain and Charles' fathers worked. Charles' father, Brian, died that day, but Cain's father, Kurt, survived. At Brian's funeral, Kurt took the opportunity to move in on Charles' mother, Sharon, and before long they were married. What's important to understand is that Charles' family was very wealthy, so not only was Kurt taking advantage of the situation to marry Sharon, but this was also his way into a vast fortune. Young Charles knew what Kurt was up to from the beginning, but it took Sharon much longer, and by then it was too late. At that point, Kurt was already living at their estate and showed little interest in the Xaviers. Even worse, he brought his son Cain to live with them, who had just been expelled from school. Cain was a bully to Charles, and the two of them never got along. Sadly, Sharon died not long after this, leaving Charles alone with Kurt and Cain. One day, he overheard them get into an argument where Cain suggested that Kurt was to blame for the death of Charles' father. This angered Kurt, and Cain lashed out by spilling all the chemicals in his lab. This caused an explosion, and Kurt carried both Charles and Cain to safety. Kurt was fatally injured though, and with his last words he told Charles that Brian's death was indeed an accident, and that Kurt probably could have saved him, but he fled instead. But with Kurt dead, this left Cain and Charles alone to live together. Jumping ahead a few years, Charles gained better control of his telepathic powers, which he used to excel in both academics and sports. Cain was extremely jealous of Charles' accomplishments, and was insecure in feeling that Charles was better than him, which caused a lot of animosity between them. Fast forwarding some more, Charles and Cain later ended up serving in the same unit in the Korean War. While under fire, Cain deserted, and Charles chased after him in hopes of convincing him to come back. Their chase led them into a cave, which was coincidentally the lost temple of Sidorak, where Cain found a mysterious ruby and read its inscription. Whosoever touches this gem shall possess the power of the crimson bands of Sidorak. Henceforth, you who read these words shall become forevermore a human juggernaut. If Sidorak sounds familiar, he's an ancient magical deity whose name Dr. Strange invokes when casting the spell of the Crimson Bands of Sidorak, something you might recall him using against Thanos during Infinity War. Going back to Cain though, he was then transformed into the Juggernaut, increasing his size while also granting him armor, super strength, enhanced durability, but most notably is that while in motion, the Juggernaut can't be stopped. But that brings me to my other point, which is that Juggernaut isn't actually a mutant, since his powers were granted through the mystical gem of Sidorak, not mutant DNA. Still, he's a regular foe to the X-Men and is often associated with mutants. Then we have Magneto, who's easily the biggest threat to emerge from the prison. He looks great too, and I really like how striking his classic costume looks in the game. I'm not sure how I feel about his face model, but it's certainly creepy and adds to the intimidation of such a powerhouse being released into the world again. In the game's lore, Magneto has already ripped the metal from Wolverine's skeleton once before, so knowing that detail made him feel even scarier to me, making him the villain I was least looking forward to facing, but in the best possible way. It's a good thing because I'd say this cutscene is very successful in its ability to instill dread in the player. But we don't even have time to dwell on it because we have other pressing matters to attend to first, namely, finding a cure for Wolverine. In the next area, we'll find a new droid to control, so we get another fun section where we completely annihilate any security that gets in our way. In contrast to that though, we'll soon encounter another really frustrating level. At one point, we'll enter an empty room and the only thing we can do is hit a button. This button activates security measures in the room, which I thought was cool at first, assuming we'd use this weaponry against the soldiers, but no, this instead activated a bunch of turrets in the room against us and alerted a group of armed guards to enter the area. There's nothing you can do about it, and you're left trapped in the room against all that firepower. You can die very easily in this section, and it's not immediately clear how best to deal with the situation. For starters, I didn't realize until checking the strategy guide that you can just punch the turrets back into the wall. Looking back, the only other time I did this was once with the Void Drone, but it's such a powerhouse that you expect it to one-shot anything it hits, so I didn't think I could just tap a turret back into the wall with a single punch from Wolverine. But even knowing you can do that doesn't make this section easy, since you still have a whole fire team taking shots at you while you attempt to deal with the turrets. My solution was to perform a bunch of dive attacks to knock the turrets out first while evading fire, but this still only got me so far since I repeatedly died shortly after. Surprisingly, instead of executing flawless stealth prior to entering this room, I found that it was better to get caught and trigger alarms ahead of time so that the turrets engage you early before any guards show up. Purposefully botching your stealth feels counterintuitive though, and again, you would only know to do this after dying at least once before, which feels a bit unfair. But once the turrets are dealt with, you still need to do a lot of diving and sliding to quickly ping each enemy since these evasive attacks cause them to drop their guns. Of course, the camera adds to the difficulty, making it hard to aim your slides. The goal though is to get all the enemies to drop their guns so that it's just a 10v1 melee battle from here on, at which point it's all about positioning, trying to line up strike moves so you can damage multiple enemies at once. Overall, this room was incredibly difficult and provided very little margin for error. It took multiple retries just to develop a strategy, and then multiple retries after that once I knew what to do. I bring this up because I want to illustrate why this game has such a reputation for being difficult, and a lot of it feels unnecessary, but we'll see some additional examples as we continue. But after defeating the enemies and retrieving their keycard, we'll continue into the next room. Initially, I felt a great deal of relief to finally move forward, but that relief quickly turned to dread as I entered the room, only to see 2 droids blocking my path and realizing that my progress hadn't saved at all. So you can imagine how I felt when I was quickly obliterated by one of the droids. So after dealing with that difficult ambush room again, I decided to just haul ass past those turrets instead of attempting to fight them, which thankfully worked. And finally, in the next room, we catch up to the scientists we've been searching for. These two are none other than Doctors Hines and Cornelius, who worked alongside the professor during Logan's experimentation. Cornelius tries to explain that they were never fully on board with the ethics of the experiment, but Wolverine isn't very sympathetic. He eventually eases up thanks to Dr. Hines, who gives Logan the written formula for the Part A serum he needs. Wolverine attempts to telepathically speak to Charles, but Cornelius tells him that the void is lined with lead to prevent any telepathic communication. This means Logan needs to make his way back to the surface of the prison, so he exits the room, leaving Cornelius and Hines alive. But back on the surface, we encounter another problem.
Juggernaut. Cyborg or not, that was just plain rude.
Who died and made you miss manners? Better get scared, short stuff! You know you're no match for me!
We're immediately thrust into a boss fight against Juggernaut, and the Void security has taken the opportunity to erect an energized fence to surround us. So while we attempt to subdue Juggernaut, the security guards lob gas grenades into the arena in hopes of knocking us out. If we linger in the gas too long, we'll become poisoned, as well as temporarily stunned, leaving us open to Juggernaut, who is constantly attempting to trample us. While Juggernaut is in motion, he's invincible, so we have to use the environment against him. This boss fight functions a lot like the Rhino fight from Neversoft's Spider-Man, where we had to treat Rhino like a bull, letting him charge us before dodging at the last second to electrocute him. We'll do the same to Juggernaut by attempting to run him into the electric pillars powering the fence. When we do so, he'll be left stunned in the center of the arena, allowing us to trigger a strike on him where Wolverine stabs at his helmet in hopes of removing it. This resembles the X-Men strategy against Juggernaut in the comics, where the goal is to remove his helmet since it blocks psionic attacks, so removing it leaves him open to Xavier, who can take him down with a thought. Xavier won't be aiding us like that in this fight though, so removing his helmet won't do much good. In fact, you'll see in a moment that it never gets removed. However, Wolverine's stabs still damage him, as well as piss him off, so the strikes are effective, and this pattern of electrocuting him and stabbing at his helmet is what will follow throughout the duration of this boss fight. Still, it's not an easy fight, and things get more challenging during the second phase, where Juggernaut begins to unleash powerful shockwaves. Timing these jumps is a bit tough due to the camera angle and sluggish controls, but it's manageable, and the goal is still the same, to lure Juggernaut into the pillars as he races towards us. We'll continue to stab at his helmet, and eventually we'll enter phase 3 of the fight. Juggernaut will unleash even more shockwaves, now via a ground pound and a thunderclap. I like the little slow walk he does afterwards too, since I thought that was an intimidating touch. If we can get him to charge into the pillars a couple more times though, we'll get to stab him again, leaving him dazed. At this point, we've won the boss fight, but to neutralize Juggernaut for good, Colossus leaps into the arena to give us a hand. When we approach him, this will trigger a unique strike called Fastball Special, where Colossus launches Wolverine at Juggernaut to knock him out. This is an iconic move from the comics, also called Fastball Special, where Colossus launches Wolverine at an enemy for devastating results, so it's really awesome to see it utilized in the game, and it's just as satisfying. With Juggernaut taken care of, Wolverine and Colossus discuss the other mutants that escaped, and Colossus informs him that Omega Red and Magneto are still on the loose. Like in the comics, it seems security guarding hasn't panned out for Colossus.
Enhanced security? I'm sorry, bud, but after all this, you're gonna get fired for sure.
As you say, maybe I should not give up on the day job.
Now that you've blown your chances of promotion, mind telling me how to take down the quantum disruption shield? Pretty please. I hear you, pal.
Thanks to Colossus' suggestion, we next man a turret to destroy the force field surrounding the prison, and although this sounds like the setup for a really awesome shooting section, it actually ended up being my least favorite level in the game, and I found it to be a glaring example of how levels are structured to be challenging in frustrating ways, making them unnecessarily difficult. The gameplay is pretty straightforward to begin with. Enemy soldiers begin to run out onto the field and we have to shoot them before they shoot us. The controls of the turret are floaty, so it can be tough to get a precise shot on them, but thankfully there is some decent splash damage to make this manageable. It's also not clear if you're supposed to bother with the enemies much, or prioritize shooting at the tower, which you have to destroy to escape the prison. You don't have much time to test out strategies either, because the soldiers' rifles can take you out in a matter of seconds. This brings us to my biggest problem with this level. Since soldiers can kill you so quickly, it's essentially a memorization game where you have to learn the order in which the enemies spawn in and from what sides, so you know what direction to be looking as they enter the area, so you can start shooting early to prevent them from getting any shots off. To successfully do this, you need to either die a lot of times to learn the proper order, or buy the strategy guide which tells you the order to shoot them. Another thing that bothered me about this level is the moment where a helicopter spawns in. If a rifle can do you in quickly, a helicopter will easily one-shot you, right? So you'd think that you need to prioritize taking it down. Well, while you're looking at the helicopter, a swarm of enemies will spawn in off-screen to your left and wipe you out almost instantly. According to the strategy guide, the helicopter is a bit of a fake out, since you're better off eating the missile that it fires at you so you can instead focus the soldiers that are ambushing. If you're fast enough, you can still take out the helicopter and all the guards, but you're eating damage regardless. But ultimately, my point is that the challenge in this level feels unfair since the only way you're beating this level is by memorizing the proper order to shoot groups as they spawn in, which is quite deflating. We just defeated a boss and we're about to make our grand escape, so this turret should feel like a power fantasy where we're decimating the opposing forces. This should be our Rambo hijacking an enemy attack chopper and obliterating their own camp with a kind of unstoppable moment. There can still be some challenge to it, but the player should have the upper hand enough that we feel powerful. Instead, enemies shoot through the turret like it's made of tissue paper, and the die and repeat memorization style gameplay is tedious and has the added effect of ruining any momentum or excitement I had when the level was first introduced. So I was really disappointed with this mission, especially because it was teed up as such a hell yeah kind of level, and just couldn't deliver. Moving on though, when you clear out the soldiers, they'll stop spawning in, and you'll be able to unload on the tower until it's destroyed. With the shield disabled, Wolverine telepathically communicates with Xavier to let him know he has the formula for the Part A serum. Xavier then tells Logan that there's been a massive magnetic disturbance nearby. This is surely Magneto, and Wolverine feels responsible for his release since his infiltration of the prison brought Sabretooth there. So Wolverine decides to find Magneto, while Xavier and Beast work on synthesizing Wolverine's cure. Magneto isn't Wolverine's only problem though, as shortly after this, we see a group of cybernetically enhanced mutant hunters gear up to take out Wolverine and Magneto.
Attention mutant hunters. Attention mutant hunters. Your contract has been activated. Retrieve all escaped mutants. Surveillance cameras have identified the intruder as a mutant known as Wolverine.
You want him breathing or not, Warden?
Whatever's easier, Mage Use.
Just what I like to hear. Power up acoustic and visual enhancement units. All weapon modules on ready mode.
Weapon mods hot.
Mutant hunters will deploy in the troop coupe transports. I'll be flying cover and command in the Phantom gunship. Yo, what do you call a mutant waving a white flag, boys?
A moving target!
You got it!
I believe these mutant hunters are an original creation for the game, but they seem to be based on the Reavers from the comics. The Reavers are cybernetically enhanced mercenaries that regularly go up against the X-Men and Wolverine. They've been led by characters like Donald Pierce, who you might recall from the Logan film, as well as Lady Deathstrike, who you might remember from the X2 movie. This female hunter is an original creation as well, and the game's bio lists her as Medusa. Even though the game seems to introduce her in a way that teases her being an important character moving forward, we won't really see much of her after this, but I still have more I want to discuss about her in a moment. From here though, Wolverine heads to Magneto's location, while Xavier provides more details about what he's walking into. Apparently, Magneto is at a steel mill and hopes to use its resources to remove a power dampening collar that was attached to him at the prison. The good news is that Magneto isn't at full power, which gives Wolverine a fighting chance against him. If he manages to remove that collar though, he'll be a big problem. Wolverine then finds an abandoned motorcycle, which he uses to race to Magneto's location. Logan is often seen riding motorcycles in the comics, so I thought this was a nice character detail. Eventually, Wolverine makes it to the mill. He departs his bike, takes a quick sniff of the area, and then hops the fence. Nothing too exciting, I know, but I mentioned this because it was part of a longer cutscene that was for some reason cut. It actually features another popular Marvel character, so I'll let you check out this deleted scene for yourself.
Easy there, buddy.
You picked a bad day to come sneaking up on me, bub. I'd say you strayed off your home turf a bit.
Heard about the big bust out at the Void. So I rode out here in the chartered bus along with the other superheroes who can't fly or teleport.
Right, and my Aunt Tilly body doubles for Madonna.
Can you use a hand here? I hear you're ramping up for a showdown with Magneto.
Well, amongst other things. If you want to help, deal with this chaos till damage control gets here.
Yeah, sure.
I got me a date.
It's really awesome seeing Spider-Man make a cameo appearance here, and even cooler is that he's voiced by Reno Romano, who also voiced him in Neversoft's Spider-Man game. Interestingly, this isn't the first X-Men game to feature Reno's Spider-Man either, since in 2001 he also appeared in X-Men Mutant Academy 2 as an unlockable playable fighter. X2's Spider-Man cameo could also be a nod to a blooper from the first X-Men movie.
I am completely in the wrong movie. I am so sorry.
I also like Spider-Man's suit design here. To me, it feels like a nice blend of his classic comic outfit with some inspiration from the Sam Raimi movie suit. It looks great and is really striking. It's also nice seeing these two characters interact in the game, since they never did in the movies. My only complaint with Spider-Man are his animations, which seem overdone, as if he downed a few too many energy drinks on his way here. Other than that, it's awesome seeing him make an appearance, but I'm left wondering why they chose to cut this out. Well, originally, the plan was to have Spider-Man assist Wolverine in a level where civilians need to be rescued from a building. The player would secure the civilians as Wolverine, at which point Spider-Man would swing in to take them to safety. I believe the following cut voice line is associated with that level idea.
If you want to help, Webslinger, we got people trapped by fire. I could sure use a hand getting them out of here.
Sadly, this level concept didn't make it very far, but a Spider-Man cameo appearance remained in the form of the cutscene we saw. My assumption as to why this cameo didn't make it into the final game is probably because it serves no purpose. We won't see Spider-Man again, and he has no impact on the coming levels. If I were to speculate further, I wouldn't be surprised if there was concern that he might overshadow Wolverine a bit, where maybe the players would be left wanting to play as Spider-Man after seeing him. Insomniac had similar concerns when debating on a Tony Stark cameo for their PS4 game, so maybe Genepool were thinking the same thing. Regardless, it's fun to see Spider-Man make an appearance here, even if it exists only as a deleted scene. But now that we've made it to the steel mill, Magneto takes a moment to greet us.
Ah, Logan. We meet again, and in a place where steel flows in rivers, and lightning converges with gravity.
Watch out for moving objects, Logan. I'm sure they have intent to do you harm.
As Xavier warned, Magneto is levitating objects in the environment as if they have a mind of their own. We'll have to stay attentive of our surroundings so we aren't accidentally damaged by rogue debris. Not only that, but the mutant hunters have entered the area and they have some critical upgrades. The first of which is cloaking tech, making them hard to see. That's not all, as they also have poisonous bullets that nullify our healing factor. Some of them even have electrified suits, which hurt us if we attack them with our claws. So these guys mean business, and I actually like the challenge they provide, since they're manageable but require you to vary your attacks. For example, we need to be more mindful of using our claws now, so we're forced to mix in more barehanded attacks than we were previously. We also need to be more expeditious about getting guns out of their hands, so we can maintain our healing factor. So ultimately, I like the elements of strategy that the mutant hunters bring to the game, but more importantly, that they still feel balanced and in alignment for what you'd expect from a late game foe. We can't forget about Magneto though, who's made his way to a generator, which he'll use to power himself up. When you first make it to the generator, some hunters will show up to fight you. At first, my instinct was to take them out, but you'll later learn that they infinitely spawn back in if you defeat them, so you're better off ignoring them. As far as preventing Magneto from drawing enough power from the generator, you need to destroy 4 electrical panels in the area, but of course, Magneto has them shielded. There's nothing you can do about this except wait. Occasionally, Magneto will shift his focus to an explosive tank and use some of his power to try and drop it on us. This shift in focus forces him to remove the shield from one of the panels, giving us a brief window to destroy them. The strategy guide had a really helpful hint for this section too, since it mentions that hunters can't climb ladders, so you can just climb up to this rooftop and wait for Magneto to free one of the panels, making this section very easy. However, if you're not sure what to do in this level, like I was the first few times, Magneto might successfully power himself up before you can destroy all 4 panels. In that case, it's surprisingly not game over. Instead, Magneto will move to the next section of the map like normal, but you'll get a message stating that he's now at full power. However, I didn't notice a difference between the levels whether you stop him from charging or not. Still, it's probably safest just to prevent him from doing it. In the next section, Magneto creates a vortex that you need to destabilize. In order to do so, you need to defeat the incoming hunters near the vortex, which results in their bodies being lifted into it. Magneto can accidentally help you with this too, if you position the enemies between you and the vortex so the debris hits them instead of you. Once enough enemies are sucked into the vortex, it'll destabilize, and Magneto will head into the steel mill for your final showdown.
Give up, Logan. This is senseless. You, of all my foes, I respect the most, for you have integrity. And you have honor.
I ain't forgetting that you ripped the adamantium out of me once. Nothing respectful about that.
And now we duel again. Even with my powers tempered by this cursed device, I am far more powerful than you.
I didn't come this far to take a rain check, Magneto. I came to rumble.
As you'd expect, a fight against Magneto is very difficult, especially for Wolverine, and I'd say that this is easily the most difficult boss fight in the game. The environment itself is tough to traverse, with a large number of levitating debris traveling through the area, as well as projectiles being fired at you by Magneto. Being hit by anything knocks you to the ground, resulting in a slow standing back up animation, which becomes tedious due to how often you'll be knocked down, especially in combination with Magneto's other attacks. For example, Magneto will occasionally levitate you, forcing you to shake free from his control, and he can do this back to back. So traversal feels very stop and go here, as something typically hinders your movement, and it's often out of your control. You'll be doing a lot of running around during this fight too, as you attempt to catch up to Magneto as he flies around the mill. Keeping track of him is a challenge in itself, since he flies all over the place. Thankfully, your senses play a crucial role in detecting him, allowing you to pinpoint his location. Your goal is to intercept him as he pauses in certain areas. This gives you an opening to strike, and if you can catch up to him during one of these moments and jump to him, Wolverine will damage him as they both fall to the ground. Not even this is always safe though, as some drops lead you into lava down below, setting you on fire and hurting you more than Magneto. One detail I like though is that the environment is destructible, so as you're both falling, you'll occasionally break different platforms on your way down, which I thought helped make the fight feel more chaotic. However, it did also have the side effect of making the area harder to traverse, which in other circumstances I would consider that to be a positive aspect, but since the area is already tough to navigate, this felt like more of a con. Another layer to this fight is that Magneto will occasionally head to a magnet in the area, which is tied to the magnet meter above his health. The longer he's in the magnet, the more the meter will drain. If you allow him to stay within it long enough, about 10 seconds to be exact, Magneto will remove his power dampening collar and it'll be an immediate game over. Even if you interrupt him in time, he can still severely hinder you if you manage to drain the meter enough. For example, at a certain threshold, he can completely disable your healing factor. So this boss fight is very tricky since you have to remain vigilant of so many things while also trying to swiftly run through the environment to grab Magneto. So like I said, this was definitely the hardest boss fight in the game. I know Magneto should be tough, but I think this fight could have been dialed back slightly, like with a reduced rate of projectiles to make traversing the area less of a slog, or removing strikes against Magneto that result in you falling in lava, since it's tough enough just to get to him in the first place. In all fairness though, I imagine it's really tough balancing a fight between Wolverine and Magneto, since Magneto can so easily handle Wolverine, so I like Genepool's idea to limit Magneto's power with the collar, but also allow him to scale up as the fight progresses. Unfortunately, I think all the projectiles and environmental obstacles tip the scales too much in Magneto's favor. Regardless, it's really satisfying when you perform that final strike on Magneto and knock him out for good. And with him defeated, we're now heading into Act 6, the last level of the game.
Like it or not, you're going back to the void.
You must hurry, Wolverine. The virus is taking hold.
Savor this small victory. It will be your only one.
Logan, there is too much magnetic interference where you are for Rogue to home in on you with the Blackbird's instruments.
Any ideas, Chuck?
Make your way back to the city, to the top of the Xenon building. There's a navigation beacon we can home in on.
I'm out of here. Get scarce if you know what's good for you, girlie.
You looking for a ride to the Xenon building?
How'd you know that?
Maybe you are a good guy after all. I owe you one, Wolverine. I'm backing your play.
Lady Deathstrike.
They were all cyborgs under my control. Except for Sabretooth, of course. He did it for money, and for the pleasure of causing you pain.
You set this up? What for, Yuriko? Don't you know I'm dying?
Revenge, you fool! I wanted your death to be in my hands. You, who are bonded with the adamantium process invented by my father. You, who stole my legacy.
You want the adamantium back that bad? Come and get it.
Okay, so a lot just got dumped on us here, so let's take a step back and digest what's going on. We'll start with Medusa, who shows up out of the blue to give us a lift and trick us into believing that she's an ally. Her appearance feels very out of nowhere, and I think that's because she was originally meant to have a larger role. I based that assumption on some cut voice lines, which seemed to indicate she was planned to be a boss fight at one point.
You weren't expecting that, were you? How does it feel, mutant? Bad, I hope. You're going down for the count. I've got you now, mutant trash. Don't die on me, mutant. I want you to suffer more. I underestimated you, Wolverine. You're good. Really good. You got me good that time. You move fast for a little guy. I wasn't expecting that at all.
Interestingly, some of her other voice lines sound like they're from a section where she fights alongside us, potentially after fighting against us. If she ended up as an ally at some point, that could explain why Wolverine trusts her in this cutscene, and it could also explain her line about owing us one, which definitely felt like it was referencing something we didn't see in the final cut of the game. Take a listen and let me know what you think.
Let me get some licks in. Move over and let me fight too. Save some for me, Wolverine. I want a piece of this. Watch your back, mutant! Look out!
So it sounds like there was originally a lot more planned for Medusa's character than we got to see in the final game, which is a bit of a shame, but it at least explains why things feel so stitched together at the end here. Speaking of the end, let's talk about Lady Deathstrike's reveal. To start, it's cool seeing her in the game as the big bad, but the reveal is too abrupt in my opinion, mainly because it feels like she emerges out of nowhere since she hasn't been referenced or teased at all throughout the entire game. I'm not sure if it was intentional to prevent players from guessing the twist, or if there was originally more build-up, but it was cut alongside the Bravo leader and May Deuce fights. My assumption is the latter, since it feels like there were significant cuts to the second half of the story, some of which we still need to discuss. As it stands though, I do still like the revelation that there's been more going on in the background while we've been hunting for our cure, since it ties a few loose ends together. For example, we learned that May Deuce was the crazy pilot who was laughing hysterically as we were shot down in Act 2. It also explains why Bravo leader shot down the plane, but later helped us out of a pinch at Weapon X. Sabretooth handing over the Part B serum makes more sense as well, since he's been paid to cause us pain, but not let us die yet. So I like that these little seeds have been planted throughout the story. I also found it fitting that Lady Deathstrike teamed up with the cybernetic mutant hunters, since as we discussed earlier, she's teamed up with the cybernetically enhanced Reavers in the comics. Speaking of the comics, the game's reveal lines up with her character, since she's been obsessed with getting revenge on Wolverine for a while. For some better context though, let's look at her comic history. I think the best place to start is actually with her father, Kenji Oyama, otherwise known as Lord Darkwind. He began as a pilot for the Japanese military and offered to fly a kamikaze mission against an American ship in hopes of turning the tides of the war. In a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, his plane crash landed onto the ship, but none of his explosives detonated, and Kenji survived the crash. Most would call this a miracle, but Kenji felt he had been denied an honorable death, and he felt ashamed at his failure. Still, he vowed to restore both his and Japan's honor. His solution was to create an army of indestructible soldiers, and he invented a process that could bond adamantium onto the human skeleton. See where this is going? Unfortunately for Kenji, now calling himself Lord Darkwind, his formula was stolen. This set him back for a while, but he eventually managed to redevelop his formula, but now he needed a test subject. This actually brings us to Daredevil. After Bullseye killed Elektra, Daredevil and Bullseye fought, and their battle ended up on a wire high above the city. Bullseye fell from this height, and the impact shattered his spine. Lord Darkwind learned of Bullseye's injuries, and had him smuggled to Japan. Darkwind used Bullseye as his test subject, and actually managed to repair his body using his adamantium process. Darkwind's hope was that Bullseye would feel indebted to him after this, and perform a free assassination for him. Darkwind should have researched Bullseye more, because he's not the type to do things for free. So Bullseye lied and agreed to the proposition, but later secretly fled the island because Darkwind wouldn't pay him. Also on the island was Daredevil and Yuriko Oyama, Darkwind's daughter, who will later come to know as Lady Deathstrike. Together, they hoped to stop Bullseye's bonding process, as well as Lord Darkwind. Yuriko actually hated her father because he scarred her and her siblings to brand them as loyal to his cause. She also hated the fanaticism he bred within his followers, who would risk their lives in devotion to him. When Yuriko and Daredevil caught up to Darkwind, she was the one who killed him. After this incident, Yuriko strangely had an abrupt change of heart at some point. She began to learn more about her father and what drove him, to the point she felt she needed to uphold his legacy and renew his adamantium bonding process. With Darkwind dead though, she'd have to run down prior experiments to learn more. This brings us to Wolverine, who was created using Darkwind's stolen formula. Lady Deathstrike aimed to retrieve his adamantium skeleton to study it. In their first encounter, Deathstrike was still human, but brought along an electromagnetically tempered sword, as well as an army of her father's followers to defeat Wolverine. With some help from Alpha Flight members Puck and Vindicator, they were able to defeat Deathstrike and her army. From here, Yuriko felt that she needed additional enhancements to better stand against Wolverine. To do so, she sacrificed her humanity and made a deal with the sorceress Spiral, who transformed her body into a cybernetic one, while also coating her skeleton in adamantium. In addition to this, her fingers were replaced with adamantium claws. Contrast this with the movie, where she's essentially Wolverine 2.0, General Stryker's next attempt at bonding a mutant with adamantium, whereas in the game, she looks like a cyborg, which is more in line with the comics. It looks like Genepool were also toying with a more comic-accurate design for her at one point, based on this concept art of her in the bonus menu, and it looks pretty cool. I think Genepool did a good job with her final design though, since it's a good blend of the movies and comics. The black leather and metal claws make her recognizable for fans who are only familiar with the film, but her cybernetics are also implemented for comic fans. And as far as her usage in the game, even though I'm a bit lukewarm on her abrupt introduction, she does still feel like a fitting character to serve as a final boss. She had a very impactful and memorable fight against Wolverine in the movie, making her a familiar and intimidating antagonist for film fans to encounter. But even more generally, I like how she contrasts with Wolverine. He had his humanity forcefully taken away from him so others could turn him into a weapon, while Deathstrike willingly gave her humanity away to be a weapon. I also appreciate that Wolverine makes a small comment about that too.
You're more metal than flesh, Yuriko.
But now let's get into the final fight and discuss how it works. At this point, the Shiva virus only needs 10 minutes before it goes critical, and it's already at a point where it's disabled our healing factor, so we'll need to deal with Deathstrike quickly if we want a chance to survive. We'll also need to make it from here to the helipad on the other side of the roof so we can meet Rogue, who's on her way with the serum. Each section of the rooftop acts as a phase against Lady Deathstrike, with this first phase being a one-on-one fight. It's pretty straightforward, and I actually like this phase a lot. The fight feels tense, and as I've mentioned, I think the 1v1 combat mechanics are pretty solid, so I thought this was a good way to open the level. This isn't exactly a fair fight though, since Deathstrike's healing factor is still fully functional, so once we get her health down halfway, we'll perform a strike that throws her across the rooftop. This is our window to get some distance, so we climb the ladder to enter phase 2. This phase isn't too complicated either, as your goal is just to destroy the 4 electrical panels in the area, which will depower an electric fence. The concept of destroying the panels may seem simple enough, but Deathstrike is determined to make sure it's not that easy. As you're running around, she'll continually make attempts to slash at you, and she'll occasionally climb up to one of the towers to throw debris at you. Not only that, but she'll also rush by to slice the pipes surrounding a panel, both to damage you and prevent you from accessing it. All that to say, you can't just stand in place and wail on each panel. Your best bet is to do a series of hit and runs on them, getting a hit or two in as you move to the next one. This phase isn't too complicated and you don't even need to fight Deathstrike, but since your healing factor is disabled, you want to minimize the damage you take here as much as possible to give you more wiggle room in the later phases. Once the panels are destroyed, you can cut through the fence and enter phase 3. Here, Deathstrike blocks your exit and slashes shockwaves at you, and like in the Juggernaut fight, jumping over these can be tricky to time. This level is worse though, since if you get hit by one shockwave, you might get hit with multiple others during your get-up animation, wiping you out entirely from just one error, so Deathstrike is really dangerous here. I also found it interesting that the camera's positioning in this phase seemed to change every new run, so I could never get comfortable with steering Logan from a specific perspective. The solution to this phase isn't immediately clear either, since you can't damage her directly and instead need to find another way. There are multiple power rods in the area, and they'll activate randomly but only briefly. Your goal is to dodge the shockwaves, and if you have a chance, punch the active rod before it deactivates again. One crucial and easily missable detail is that you have to punch the rods towards Deathstrike in order to electrocute her, as if you're punching lightning at her. If you punch in the wrong direction though, there's no indication that you need to reposition yourself, so you'll likely be left confused as to what to do, and I wish there was a bit more clarity on that front. For me, this was the most challenging section because the controls are so stiff that it was tough to time the jumps as well as aim my slices precisely. The shockwaves are so damaging too that minor mistakes can quickly lead to game over, so I really struggled here. Once you shock her enough though, she'll be stunned and you're free to run to the helipad. She's not quite down for the count yet and quickly leaps in front of us, striking a badass pose as we begin phase 4.
This begins like another normal fight, but this time you can't land a hit on Deathstrike without her blocking it. She also fights more aggressively, so I felt a lot of pressure on this last leg of the battle.
I should be honest here too, that at this point in the fight, after so many retries, I just paused and checked the guide to see what I needed to do to prevent another retry, so I can't say I figured this one out on my own, but what you need to do here is attack Deathstrike to slowly push her back against the ledge of the helipad, at which point you can perform a strike to knock her off the ledge, which will conclude the game. However, if you're not careful and end up near the ledge yourself, Deathstrike can push you off instead. As far as this boss fight overall though, I thought it was a decent climactic battle. I liked the different phases that required new tactics as we moved from area to area, and I liked how persistent and threatening Deathstrike was. She herself was really cool to fight, and I liked that she had a good variety of attacks to keep her dangerous and unpredictable. So structurally, I thought this boss fight was well conceived. It's just other aspects of the gameplay that mess with my enjoyment, like the rough maneuverability when trying to dodge the shockwaves, or the lack of visual indications to tell you whether or not you were doing something correctly, like with the electric rods. Like with many of the other levels in this game, solutions are often unclear, making this boss fight a lot of trial and error, die and repeat, to learn the necessary method of beating each phase to move on to the next one. For me, that removed a lot of the fun, and instead made things feel like a grind, which is disappointing because I think the boss fight itself had a lot of potential, but different elements hold it back. We'll talk about it more as we get into the gameplay section of this video though, since I think it applies to the entire game. But next, after knocking Deathstrike off the ledge, that completes the game and begins a string of end cutscenes. Buckle up because we're about to get a lot of teases real fast, so I'll let you watch this closing and then we'll discuss it together.
My death is not the death you will know, Logan. I have forsaken my humanity for revenge, and I will see no end of pain. Only an eternity of cold replacement parts and the smell of hot solder. You have won, Logan. For now!
Rogue will be with you soon, Logan. Hang in there.
Sugar? You look like something the cat dragged in. Best have a slug of this here serum that Hank mixed up for you.
It's you, little helper, Rogue. Nasty. You didn't bring me anything frosty to wash it down with, did you, darling?
I'm the pilot, not the cabin attendant, big boy. You ready to go home?
Can't ever go home again, darling. Just take me where I can put my feet up on the table and nobody cares. Reasons? Hell, maybe we all have our reasons. Ain't none bigger than revenge. Deathstrike became its slave. Revenge is a twisting, searing fire that burns deep in your belly. Take it away and you're left to face up to the reality of who and what you are. Revenge? I still want more. And maybe that's just as well.
Are you sure this is the one you want? He seems rather uncontrollable.
Yes, he is the one I need. A pure survivor. Truly one of the strong. Begin making preparations for my newest horseman.
The loudspeaker said other Alpha-class mutants got loose. Who are we talking about here?
Magneto and Omega Red. Omega Red.
Okay, where to begin? First, it's great seeing another X-Men cameo, this time by Rogue. If I'm being honest, her usage here isn't my favorite. I think she's a bit too flirty with Wolverine, and the camera focuses way too much on her ass. I have to wonder if that's partially because, admittedly, her face model isn't great. In all fairness though, I'm sure it's tough to make faces look good on these older consoles, so I don't want to be too hard on them here. I do, however, want to compliment her outfit design, since it seems to be a blend of her all-green suits with the addition of the iconic brown jacket. I think it fits with the darker color palette of the rest of the game, while still feeling true to the comics, so I like this look a lot. Then we have Wolverine, who is now cured of the Shiva virus and can head home. He's not the only one cured either, as Sabretooth retrieves a vial from Lady Deathstrike before carrying her away. I'm not sure what his plans are for her, but I'm guessing some kind of team-up. Due to her cybernetic body, Deathstrike can be repaired, so she's definitely not dead. If I had to guess what his plans are for her, it could be similar to a moment in the comics where Sabretooth concocted a scheme to torture Wolverine by attacking those closest to him. The muscle he enlisted to do so was Lady Deathstrike and Omega Red. They weren't exactly willing allies, but Sabretooth managed to steal valuable files, tech, and money from Weapon X, which he offered to share with them if they helped him. Of course, Sabretooth later went back on that promise, but regardless, he managed to secure a team-up between them for a time. I'm not positive that's where the game was heading, but I think pieces are in place for something like that. The last we saw of Omega Red was when he was freed by Sabretooth, so perhaps they've been traveling together since then. And as we saw at the end of the last cutscene, Omega Red was indeed being teased for the sequel. Interestingly, that wasn't the original plan, as there are some audio files for a cut boss fight against Omega Red. These first 3 clips are from Wolverine, but the rest after are Omega Red himself. A fun detail is that he was also voiced by Mark Hamill.
Whoa there, comrade. Death aura. Nice trick, Red. Like it or not, you're going back to the void. Are you feeling the poison yet, dog? Now you are to be dying horribly. I live, you die. Life is good, yeah? Are you hurting greatly? Choroso. Scream, little man. Is music to my ears. Pain like this you should have forever. A treacherous capitalist trick. You are being lucky that time. I am hurting from that one. That one will cost you, pig. You have almost killed Omega Red with that one. Your claws are sharp, mutant.
So it seems like Genepool opted to remove Omega Red from the game and transition him into a major player for the sequel. Already, that gives us a trio of heavy hitters for Wolverine to face, but there's still the biggest cliffhanger to discuss: Apocalypse. So for those of you that aren't familiar, we're introduced to two villains here, Mr. Sinister on the right, and his leader Apocalypse on the left. Starting with Apocalypse, he's an ancient mutant who believes in mutant supremacy and also lives by the code survival of the fittest. To aid in his conquests, he often recruits 4 powerful beings to his side, which he calls his 4 horsemen. Mr. Sinister is not a horseman, but he is a close servant of Apocalypse. Sinister was originally a normal man by the name of Nathaniel Essex, who lived before the emergence of mutants. He was a brilliant geneticist and predicted the coming of the mutant gene, something he was dedicated to learn more about. The opportunity came when he encountered Apocalypse, who offered him great power and the ability to live to see the emergence of mutants, with the cost that Nathaniel would live as his loyal servant. Nathaniel ultimately decided to take the offer, and Apocalypse used the technology from his celestial ship to make him superhuman. From this point, Nathaniel Essex was dead, and only Mr. Sinister lived on. However, Sinister isn't fully loyal to Apocalypse, and mostly serves him as a means to further his scientific research. So it's not uncommon for Sinister to betray Apocalypse, and perhaps that could have come into play in the hypothetical sequel. Going back to the cliffhanger, it seems that Sinister and Apocalypse are reviewing footage for a new Horseman. When I initially watched this, my assumption was that Apocalypse was referring to Wolverine, but after watching it, the screen seems to focus a lot on Sabretooth towards the end, and everything they're discussing could apply to him as well.
Are you sure this is the one you want? He seems rather uncontrollable.
Yes, he is the one I need. A pure survivor. Truly one of the strong. Begin making preparations for my newest horseman.
In the comics, Apocalypse at one point pitted both Sabretooth and Wolverine against each other in a battle to earn the right to become his next horseman. This took place after Wolverine's adamantium skeleton had been removed by Magneto, so he was still running around with just bone claws. Sabretooth, on the other hand, had been given an adamantium skeleton by Apocalypse, swinging the balance in his favor. However, Wolverine hated the thought of Sabretooth being unleashed under the leadership of Apocalypse, so he fought to win in hopes that maybe he could shake off whatever programming Apocalypse planned to implement within him. So Wolverine ultimately wins the fight by stabbing Sabretooth deep into his guts, knocking him out. Apocalypse then chose to remove the adamantium that he had given Sabretooth and instead bond it to Wolverine, his new champion, while also turning him into his new horseman, Death. This is how Wolverine got his adamantium back in the comics, so I'm not sure how he got it back in the game. Regardless, I could see something like this happen in a sequel where Sabretooth and Wolverine are pitted against each other, or maybe Sabretooth becomes the Horseman Death and Wolverine has to defeat a souped-up Sabretooth along with the other 3 horsemen. Either way, I'm really liking what this cliffhanger potentially sets up, and even if I'm off base on my speculations, I still think this is an interesting direction to take things, and it leaves some great story and gameplay opportunities open. Sadly, we never got a sequel to this game, even though we did get a game for the 3rd X-Men movie. However, it's not a direct continuation of Wolverine's Revenge, and is instead based on the movies. It's quite disappointing because despite this game's flaws, I enjoyed its narrative and its connection to the comics. I really would have liked to have seen it continue with a sequel, especially because this is such an intriguing cliffhanger. So I'm really disappointed that this is where we have to leave the game's story. As far as the main game though, I did really enjoy the story of X2 Wolverine's Revenge. I think it had some great callbacks and references to the comics, and it feels like a fun solo story that you'd find in a Wolverine series, which makes sense since it was written by Larry Hama. I also like that it didn't shy away from the brutality of Wolverine, providing a darker and oftentimes scarier tone. The only problems I really had with the story revolved around the abruptness of certain characters. Lady Deathstrike is the big example, showing up out of nowhere as the big bad, but also characters like Maydeus and Bravo Leader, although I believe this to be due to significant cuts in the later half of the game. Not only just their boss fights, but I think there was a big level cut as well, based on some unlockable concept arts. For example, here's one that shows Wolverine in a drainage tunnel surrounded by what I believe to be hand ninjas. I think we mostly associate hand ninjas with Daredevil, but Wolverine faces them quite a bit in the comics too. I imagine that concept ties in with the next one, which seems to have a Japanese setting. In the comics, Wolverine spent time in Japan, and that's also where Lady Deathstrike and her father originate from, so I could see this being a level where we'd learn more about Deathstrike before her boss fight. That's just my speculation, of course, but I think it makes sense and could fill in some of the gaps I'm feeling within the current story. Regardless, I still enjoyed the story that we received in the main game and what it provided in regard to a classic Wolverine tale. But now I think it's time we continue on and have a more in-depth discussion about the gameplay, as well as the unlockable bonus content. So to start, I'm pretty divided on how I feel about the overall gameplay of X2. There are a lot of things that I really liked about it, but there are also plenty of aspects that I found especially frustrating, and unfortunately, I think those negatives ended up overpowering my enjoyment of the rest of the game. So to start, one of the biggest hindrances of the gameplay was the camera. This thing will begin swinging around unexpectedly at the most inopportune times, like when you're trying to walk a tight path between two holes in the ground, or when you're trying to slide into enemies. My guess is that Genepool wanted the camera to adjust itself on the fly to aid the player in hopes that they could go through the game without worrying about the camera. Sadly, that's not the result, and instead I found myself fighting the camera just as much as the enemies. Another big issue I had is how unnecessarily slow things can feel, and I don't mean stealth. I actually like the stealth element of the game since it was satisfying getting the drop on enemies and strategically taking them out one by one. My issue is with other aspects of the game, like the way transitions between movements feel so clunky. For example, if you go into senses mode, Wolverine will need to pause for a second and get into the proper stance before he can continue forward. The same goes for getting into a crouch position, where you have to pause and wait for him to fully enter that position before you can begin to move again. It doesn't feel seamless at all and makes the movements feel slow and robotic. The same goes when trying to cling to walls or get into position for a takedown, especially if the game doesn't fully register that you're behind an enemy, forcing you to reposition yourself to trigger the strike. So I think the stealth itself is good, but the surrounding mechanics associated with it often dampen that enjoyment. Also on the slow side is health regeneration. It's awesome that you can heal to full health naturally, and I like the restriction that you need to be out of locked-on combat and have your claws sheathed to do so. However, it's so tedious standing around waiting to heal all the way back up, and that kills a lot of momentum. I wish they included a mechanic where you could hold a button down to rapidly heal that health back up if you're outside of combat. Since I'm going to heal all the way back up anyway, an option to save some time would be nice. We should also talk a bit about the game's difficulty. X2 is known for being challenging, which I'm sure was intentional, and conceptually, I actually think it was a valid design choice. Challenging games can be a lot of fun as you continually push yourself to play better, become stronger, and master your obstacles. I think a key feature of those games, though, is that they're balanced to feel tough but fair, where by the end of losing a fight you tell yourself, I could have won that if I just dodged that last attack, or if I alter my strategy a bit, I bet I could beat this. Essentially, you still feel like you have a lot of control over defeating an opponent or challenge. And some of X2's fights did feel like that, such as with the Wendigo, where my losses were mostly due to skill issues and sloppy mistakes, which left me eager to try it again. But a lot of other sections instead left me more confused about what I was supposed to be doing in the first place. So I'd be thinking things like, what is the game expecting me to do here? Can I interact with this object? Are my attacks on this object even doing anything? I struggled with a lack of clarity in a lot of levels. Furthermore, the speed at which you can die to even normal enemies can be so quick that you aren't left with much time to problem solve puzzle sections in general, so certain areas can take multiple tries before figuring out the proper solution, let alone execute it. Sometimes I'd get so fed up with trying to solve a room the right way that I'd just sprint through it if it was possible, and that usually ended up feeling like the better approach. You'll often encounter tricky sections like this back to back without saves too. This is why I wish there were more checkpoints in the game, since I think they'd help alleviate some of the frustration. I'm not even saying I need a checkpoint for each room I enter, or even a manual save during gameplay, but just one or two additional checkpoints in each part would help to break things up. As it stands, the game feels bloated, since you have to waste time replaying earlier sections of a level just to get back to the actual area you need to attempt again. Moreover, I found it strange that some levels had extra combat encounters surrounding boss fights outside of the actual fight. The biggest example was just before the Juggernaut battle. You have to go past a long stretch of guards either by taking them out stealthily or by running through the area to reach Juggernaut. So if you lose during the Juggernaut fight, you have to go back through that section just to restart his fight again. This is unnecessarily tedious, and in that example specifically, it would have been better to just checkpoint directly before the Juggernaut boss fight, since the prior section is ultimately pointless. Things like this make it feel like the goal was to artificially pad the runtime, since the game itself is actually pretty short, at roughly around maybe 7 hours if you know what you're doing. Looking at howlongtobeat.com, most players seem to take around 10 to 12 hours on their first run, which is what it took me, and I imagine a lot of that extra time is due to all the level retries. But now that we've gone over what I didn't like in the game, let's talk about what I did like. To begin, I think they really nailed the Wolverine character. I love Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, but I'm really glad Genepool opted to base their Logan on the comics, from his look to his attitude, all the way through to his gameplay. I think one of their biggest achievements is how thoroughly they integrated all of Wolverine's abilities into the gameplay and how they gave players full control of them. Just the simple ability to extract and retract the claws at will was such a satisfying inclusion, but I really appreciate how there were pros and cons attached to it, like how the claws do more damage, but they're slower than fighting barehanded and restrict your healing factor. The melee combat is pretty solid too, and I like the offensive variety you have in your attacks. The game doesn't give you a tutorial for all of this, but if you read the game's manual, remember those? You can find a small list of combos you can perform, like an evasive backflip kick. You can also incorporate your crouch into attacks, performing things like a trip kick or an uppercut kick. These extra abilities made it fun to mix up attacks and try out different strategies against opponents. In this way, the 1v1 combat was easily the most fun, and even basic enemies provided a good challenge, and remained somewhat unpredictable. I like that the different attacks actually felt useful too, since if an enemy was constantly interrupting my claw attacks, for example, then I could switch to a barehanded approach to make up that speed, or maybe implement some kicks to give myself a little more range if I was getting outboxed. Defensively, you have a standard block that you can perform by just pulling back on the left stick, which is easy enough. Then there are evasive maneuvers like a dodge roll, which is cool, but it didn't feel responsive enough to use reliably. You can also flip over enemies, which is really handy, except for when it bugs and Wolverine doesn't clear them. But still, I enjoyed the basic melee combat a lot in this game, and I think that aspect was well done. Combat against multiple enemies, though, I'm more mixed on. The main way you're fighting off crowds is by using the strike system. Just to recap a bit, to pull off a strike move, you need to be positioned between 2 or 3 enemies based on this chart. If you manage that, you can press circle to pull off a tier 1 strike move, where Wolverine utilizes his combat expertise to acrobatically and efficiently take down these enemies. As you collect dog tags throughout the game, you'll eventually unlock tiers 2 through 4. Each new tier unlocks new strike animations, and they deal more damage than the last tier. However, you won't automatically strike with that tier just because you unlock it, since each tier requires an additional button be pressed when you trigger a strike. As you can see here, Tier 1 is just circle, then Tier 2 is circle plus triangle, ending with Tier 4 requiring you to quickly input circle, triangle, circle, triangle. Those inputs are easy to remember and quickly perform, which is nice, and it adds a small level of skill to this mechanic. When you're in the heat of battle and frantically trying to trigger a strike move though, you'd be surprised how tricky it can be to mash those 4 buttons in quick sequence. But if you can do it, Tier 4 should one-shot any enemies involved, while Tiers 1 through 3 might require another strike or 2 to finish them off. It's an intriguing system, and for this game, I think it's sufficient, but it does come dangerously close to being a little too automated for my taste. If there had ever been a sequel to this game, I honestly would have liked to have seen this strike system removed in place of something that requires more skill from the player to match the intricacy of the 1v1 fights. Since surprisingly, it's actually easier to take on 2 or 3 enemies at once compared to just one enemy due to the strike system's ease of use and damage output. Still, for what it is, I'd place the strike system in the positive category overall, along with the stealth mechanics and how they tied into Wolverine's senses. I think in summary, this game had a lot of really cool ideas that make it unique and memorable in retrospect, but it needed some more time in the oven to smooth out a lot of the technical issues that hold it back. Maybe even some additional playtesting to identify opportunities to balance some of the more frustrating missions, as well as to provide additional clarity to solutions and remove some of the time bloat. If these areas were resolved, I think I'd have an easier time enjoying the rest of the game, and I'd have a better appreciation for its higher difficulty standard and individual gameplay mechanics. Foundationally, I think there's a really great game in here, but it's being overshadowed by these issues. But now that we've discussed the general gameplay, let's take a look at the bonus content in X2 Wolverine's Revenge, starting with unlockable outfits. While you're exploring each level, it's worth going off the beaten path from time to time because you might find hidden items, one of which are comic books, and each one unlocks a new outfit. Genepool provided a solid variety of them too, so let's take a look at each one. We'll start with the default outfit since we haven't really discussed it yet. This look is from the new X-Men comic series. After the success of the first X-Men film, Marvel saw the opportunity to revamp the X-Men through this new X-Men series, which ran from 2001 to 2004. With it came a modernization to the team's uniforms, black leather with the yellow X logo. So not only was it the current outfit for Wolverine in the comics at the time, but I think it was also a good choice for the default suit based on a familiarity level, since the black leather looks similar to Wolverine's style in the movie. Speaking of which, the X2 suit is another one we can use in-game, and it's pretty cool. This Logan may not look like Hugh Jackman, but I think he pulls off the suit equally well, and using it in-game definitely makes the ties to the movie feel more legitimate, even though they're actually non-existent. For our next unlockable suit, we have the Alex Ross prototype. Alex Ross is a popular comic book artist known for his photorealistic illustrations. He's one of my personal favorites, and as a side note, I'd highly recommend checking out his work on the graphic novel Marvels, which features some gorgeous artwork alongside an intriguing story written by Kurt Busiek. As far as this Wolverine suit though, we have to go back to the new X-Men series I mentioned earlier. Prior to its release, Alex Ross pitched these designs to Marvel, but they didn't make the cut. Still, the designs were shown within an issue of Wizard magazine, and they don't look too bad. I actually kinda dig the cloaked look sported by Angel, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. For Wolverine, I like how the giant X logo is made to look like tiger striping, and I like the cowl. Alex Ross sadly hasn't had too much luck with his prototypes, as you might recall another one of his designs in the Spider-Man 1 movie game, which featured a concept suit he created for the movie that wasn't used. I like all of these designs, so I'm happy that both these Spider-Man and Wolverine suits live on inside these games. Our next suit is called Patch, hence the eye patch he's sporting. Logan used the Patch persona while laying low in the city of Madripoor during a time when the X-Men were presumed dead. The game's Patch outfit looks good, but I can't help but wish they opted to use the white suit variation, since that's the most iconic look for Patch Logan in my opinion. Still, it's a fun one to use in-game, especially when sneaking around. Our next suit is from Ultimate X-Men, a series taking place in the 1610 universe, not the mainline 616 universe. In this version, Logan's actually introduced as a hitman sent by Magneto to infiltrate the X-Men, but through his time with them, he ends up switching sides. It's a fun alternate look at the X-Men, but I felt it tried a bit too hard to be edgy, so I wasn't a huge fan personally. I might be in the minority though, as a lot of fans look back on it fondly. Regardless, the suit is awesome and it looks great in the game. The next suit is a fan favorite, the classic brown and tan, which debuted in X-Men 139. It's been used commonly ever since then, and it's one of my personal favorites, so I'm glad it made the cut in this game, and it looks awesome in gameplay. Of course, you can't have unlockable Wolverine suits and not include the most iconic one, the classic yellow and blue suit. To the left, the game references Wolverine's first appearance in Hulk 181 alongside the suit, but to me it looks a bit more reminiscent of the one from Giant-Sized X-Men #1 based on the longer ears. Okay, that doesn't really matter, but what does matter is that the suit looks really great in the game. Using it somehow makes it feel even more like a legitimate Wolverine game, and the vibrant yellow and blue look really striking amongst the darker tone of the rest of the game, so no surprise this was my favorite alternate suit to use. So naturally, it was the first one I equipped in the game's challenge modes. After beating the main story, if you're looking to test your skill further, you can find 3 challenges called dog tag challenges. They're displayed as bronze, silver, or gold, and you have to work your way through them in that order. Like with many of the levels within the main story, the bronze challenge is essentially a memorization game. Your goal is to break all 30 crates in an area before the timer runs out. The trick is that you have to break them in the proper order, indicated by boxes highlighted in red. So you're probably not going to beat this the first couple times you try it, since you'll have to waste time finding where the next lit up box is. Once you know the order though, you can burn through here much faster, so it's a relatively simple challenge. The silver one isn't as easy though, and as we'll see later, it's actually harder than the gold one. So in the silver challenge, you have to stealthily make your way through this area, taking out all 20 guards along the way. Not only that, but you only have 4 minutes to do so. The timer isn't as much of an issue, as the challenge lies more with how precise your timing needs to be. You have to quickly take out the guards one after another so that they're in the proper position by the time you get to them. There's very little margin for error, and if another guard gets a glance of you, it's instant game over. It's a very stressful challenge, and the farther you get, the more pressure you feel, since the risk of starting over feels so high. As with the rest of the game, the controls and camera work against you, making things feel even more tense than they should be. Still, I had some fun moments, like using senses to spot a pheromone trail of an enemy behind a corner, and taking down a series of enemies in quick succession. Stealth striking opponents is still very satisfying, and you at least get to do a lot of it here. Overall, I'd say this is the ultimate challenge in the game, putting all your stealth abilities to the test, but I can't say that it was overall fun. Once I completed it though, I was happy to save, and never touch it again. The gold challenge I actually liked quite a bit. Unlike the linearity of the Silver Challenge, the Gold one puts you in an open environment, with multiple guards patrolling the area. Going from 20 enemies in the Silver Challenge to 10 feels much better, and having the freedom to take them down in the order of my choosing made things more interesting. Even though I got caught a lot during this mission, I had fun puzzling my way through it to figure out the optimal order to take out guards. I know it's essentially more order memorization, but the difference here is that the freedom and strategy elements felt refreshing compared to the prior two challenges. I also had fun pushing my luck, risking getting caught in order to take out a pivotal guard, so I appreciated that there was flexibility in how creative you can be in the order you take out enemies, instead of having to figure out the one predefined route to do so I like this challenge quite a lot. As you defeat each challenge, you'll be rewarded with both artwork and bonus FMV clips. The artwork is what you'd expect, different concept for the game's levels and characters. They're pretty cool to look at, and it's fun comparing the original artwork to the final product. The outtakes are even more exciting though, as the team decided to have some fun and make some bloopers, as if characters were recording their own lines. There are 3 to unlock, so I'll let all 3 play now.
Here comes a real classic. This one I like. It's quiet. Too quiet. I love the classics. It's quiet. Too quiet. That's why it's a classic. It's great.
All right, good. Hold on, please.
Oh, it's fun to pretend, isn't it? Ah!
As far as other bonus content, we also have Cerebro files. While playing the main game, you'll occasionally come across these discs, which contain information on different characters from the story. One detail I liked is that Professor Xavier reads each bio. Here's an example.
When my stepbrother, Cain Marco, discovered the power residing within the gem of Sitarak, he became the unstoppable Juggernaut. Unfortunately, he has since used his almost limitless might to fuel his long-harbored resentment toward me, clashing time and again with myself and the X-Men over the years. Now Cain is being held in the void, there until he is either rehabilitated or we devise a means to divest him of the mystic energies which make him such a dangerous foe.
Lastly, there are cheat codes, which unlock the typical things that you'd expect, like instantly getting all outfits and collectibles, or enabling level select even if you haven't beaten the game. There is one unique one that I want to call out though, and it enables a cheat menu in-game. When you do so, you're only given 2 options, but they can be fun to play around with. One of them is freeze frame, which is kind of like this era's photo mode. Triggering it freezes the game in place without a HUD, allowing you to soak in a cinematic moment, or get a better look at something in the game. The other option allows you to turn invincibility mode on, which is actually a lot of fun. This is honestly the most Wolverine-like you can feel in the game, shrugging off bullets and feeling like an unstoppable force. It's also handy if you're really struggling with certain levels of the game and need a hand getting past it. But that's the last of the bonus content. Overall, I was very pleased with the amount of extra content included here. It may not seem like a big deal, but bonuses can go a long way towards rewarding exploration and enhancing replayability, so I really appreciate how much Genepool included in their game. But now that we've adequately discussed the gameplay and extras, let's next look at the sound design within X2 Wolverine's Revenge. Starting with the voice actors, we have to talk about Mark Hamill as Wolverine. Going into this game, his casting was the aspect I was most curious about, because I'm most familiar with him as the Joker, a character who vocally is very high-pitched and maniacal, the exact opposite of the low, gruff voice of Wolverine. But after playing the game, I was quite surprised at how well he performed this role. There were moments where his voice would slip, but for the most part, he did a good job of becoming Logan, to the point I often forgot it was Hamill behind the voice. Speaking of which, there was a behind-the-scenes video released for this game where Hamill was interviewed about the character, and we can also see him performing in the booth.
I'm recording the voice of Wolverine. It's a very special situation for me because I can't think of, except for Joker, taking on sort of this iconic character that a lot of people care about.
These dog tags, they read Wolverine.
Because once you've got the part, you think, gee, now I have the world looking to see whether I at least match what they think he must sound like.
To summarize my thoughts on Mark Hamill's Wolverine, I thought he did really well, and I would have liked to have seen him return to reprise the role if the game had been granted a sequel. Alongside Hamill is another recognizable actor, Patrick Stewart as Charles Xavier. I think he has to be one of the most committed actors to a comic book character that we've seen, because most live-action actors won't voice their character in-game unless it's tied to the movie. Patrick Stewart, on the other hand, has appeared in X-Men games that aren't movie tie-ins, such as X-Men Legends 1 and 2, as well as X-Men Next Dimension, so I really appreciate his willingness to repeatedly embrace the character as well as voiceover in gaming. As I mentioned a bit earlier, it seems he was meant to have a larger voiceover presence in the game, so I thought it would be fun to play some additional cut clips where he comments on things like unlock skills and modes, and even makes a small reference to the comic organization S.H.I.E.L.D.
Keep in the crouched position and move. You've learned a new combat move. You've learned a new stealth move. A new mode has been unlocked. Cheat mode activated. Quite, Logan. S.H.I.E.L.D. has kindly supplied some info on the base. It appears to have been here for some time.
We should also discuss some of the other actors on this game, the first of which is Fred Tatasciore, who voices Sabretooth, Juggernaut, and Magneto. All of which I think he did a phenomenal job on, providing their voices with a sense of menace. Fred is no stranger to comic book roles either, and he has a knack for portraying some of the more monstrous characters. For example, we discussed him a bit in my Batman Arkham video series, where he voices Bane in Asylum and City, as well as Solomon Grundy in Arkham City. Fred also voices the Hulk often, most notably in Hulk Ultimate Destruction, a game I hope to cover in the future. You may also recognize Fred from his role as Rhino in Insomniac's Spider-Man games, or as Damon Baird in the Gears of War series. Another actor you may recognize is Mayim Bialik, who voices May Deuce. Outside of the game, many of you will know her from the show Big Bang Theory, where she plays Amy Farrah Fowler. Also part of this voice cast is Jennifer Hale, who only has a small role here as Rogue. However, Jennifer is a very accomplished voice actress who has appeared in a number of other titles. Sticking with Marvel, you've likely most recently heard her portray Jean Grey in X-Men 97. She's also played Lilith in Marvel's Midnight Suns, a game you should definitely check out if you haven't already. Playing Beast in this game is Richard Portnow, an actor who typically only does live-action roles. His most recognizable role, in my opinion, is probably from The Sopranos as Junior's lawyer, Harold Melvoin. Lastly, I want to mention Colossus's voice actor, Ted Nordblom. Looking at his IMDb page, it doesn't look like he's done many other roles, but he's also credited as voice director on this X2 game, so my assumption is that he was primarily a voice director, but decided to play Colossus himself, which is pretty cool if true. I think he does a good job as well, and I didn't have any issues with his performance. Overall, I enjoyed everyone's performance in this game and was pleasantly surprised at the quality of voice acting. I also appreciated the game's original soundtrack, composed by Ian Livingstone. I think Ian had a good mix of ambient tracks to immerse you into each level, as well as some catchy combat tracks. I actually had difficulty picking which ones to play since they're all unique, and I imagine many of them will be nostalgic for those of you that have played this game before. So next, I'm going to play a sampling of some of my favorites so you can get an idea of the music within this game. To start, I want to play one of the slower, more ambient tracks. This one in particular is a good example of how the music amplifies the tension you feel in each level. It takes place around the Wendigo level, so it's very spooky and mysterious. Getting into some of the faster paced tracks, let's next listen to one from the first level. I like the sense of urgency it evokes, which is perfect for a brutal escape mission. Next is the music that plays during the Lady Deathstrike fight. Despite any issues I had during that level, I can't fault the background music because it's pretty awesome. It hits all the right notes. It evokes a feeling of tension, which is perfect for the climactic fight. It has a sense of urgency to match that we're on a timer, and it includes some Japanese flair to tie back to their origins. For some nostalgia, here's the main menu music, another one of my favorites. It feels very militaristic, like a man on a mission, perfect for a game called Wolverine's Revenge. So overall, a very strong OST for this game, and I loved how well it pulled me into each level, especially these spooky ambient tracks, since I think they're one of the main driving factors that makes this game feel so scary at times. They made me feel very isolated and vulnerable, like things could turn from calm to terrifying at any moment, especially combined with the legitimately creepy character models and how easily you can die. So it's no wonder this game was scary for a lot of people. But still, the OST swings in the other direction too, providing some great fight tracks to energize you for combat. I always appreciate it when a soundtrack can evoke some kind of emotion from me, so I thought Ian Livingstone did a great job on this one. But overall, I thought the sound design across the board was great, including the sound effects, acting, and music. X2 Wolverine's Revenge is a game I'm really mixed on. At its core, there are some fun mechanics and good ideas that lend themselves to a fantastic Wolverine experience. The story by Larry Hama is enjoyable and feels on par with the comics, and I really enjoyed how much control I had over Wolverine's abilities. In retrospect, this game also feels incredibly novel. A stealth-focused, difficult Wolverine game voiced by Mark Hamill certainly feels unique, and they're all aspects that I liked about the game. Sadly, too much is working against it, and it ultimately feels rushed and incomplete, which is frustrating because maybe if this game had some additional time to address its problems, maybe I'd be singing a different tune. I also have to wonder if its attachment to the movie was what hurt it in the long run, since movie tie-in games have notoriously tight deadlines, and with Genepool being a new company dealing with all the learning curves associated with that, it was surely a lot to juggle. On a similar note, bugs were apparently a big issue near release, as described in an article from fanbyte.com, where Genepool co-founder Dave Anthony states, "I think we were about 4 or 5 weeks from release and there were so many bugs in the database, like more than you can imagine. It was a very difficult project. The guy in charge of all of Activision's technology, Steve Pierce, had to literally come into the studio, sit down, and code for us. That's how down to the wire it was." So I think it's clear that Genepool needed additional time to refine their Wolverine game, time they wouldn't have had in order to release alongside the movie. It's disappointing because I really think there's a solid foundation here for something special. As it stands though, I would rate this as probably a 6 out of 10 game, since I came out of it feeling slightly more positive than negative. I think it will appeal most to experienced gamers who are looking for a challenge, but if you're a more casual player, it'll likely become too frustrating as you progress further into it. Still, it's a very unique game, and it's been a fun one for me to revisit. I truly wish Genepool had been given the opportunity to take a crack at a sequel, because I'd love to see where they'd take things from here. Sadly, Wolverine's Revenge didn't perform well enough critically or financially, so we never got that sequel. However, they did begin work on another Marvel property shortly after X2. This time, an Iron Man game set to coincide with a movie. No, not the 2008 Robert Downey Jr. movie. This was in the early 2000s when New Line Cinema acquired the rights to an Iron Man film. It didn't get too far along though, reportedly having just a draft of a script before the rights expired and reverted back to Marvel Studios. Genepool had been working on this Iron Man game for around 6 months when the call came in that it had to be cancelled, despite some very promising prototypes on their end. We can see some of this gameplay thanks to the Twitter account of Kevin Edwards, who worked on the game and recently shared footage of an old prototype. It looks really cool and I can clearly see its potential, so it's a shame they weren't able to carry on with this game, movie tie-in or not. But with the cancellation of their Iron Man game and the lack of success from X2, Genepool wasn't financially able to carry on and had to shut down. It's a sad story, especially because I think Genepool had a lot more to offer in the gaming world, and I think there was still room to grow in their Wolverine franchise. Unfortunately, it ends here with a promising cliffhanger that will never be. But X2 Wolverine's Revenge at least lives on today as a novelty, standing out amongst other Wolverine titles for its unique gameplay and ideas. I think it will continue to do so, and I'd recommend anyone who's curious about this game to try it out for fun, even if just for a few levels. But I think that wraps up my thoughts on X2 Wolverine's Revenge. So now let's discuss what's coming up next on the channel. I feel like the series is almost a myth at this point, the amount of times I said it's coming but I'd never released it, but next up is legitimately an in-depth look at Guardians of the Galaxy. This one will release a bit differently compared to prior videos though, as I'm breaking it up into a 4-part series to make it a bit more digestible, with each part being roughly about an hour in length. So keep an eye out for those coming up, and in the meantime, I have plenty of other retrospectives for you to check out, including one for the X-Men Origins Wolverine game if you're still craving some Wolverine content. But I think that'll do it for today's video, so thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.